He remembered everything, every formula, the pinout of every microchip. 7 years of work as an engineer were stored in his mind without a single gap. But living people don't remember things that way, which meant the green letters before his eyes weren't a hallucination. And that meant the world of steam and coal into which he'd been thrown would now receive technology 100 years ahead of its time. But first, let's rewind. The cold stone floor hits Daniel in the back before he regains consciousness. He opens his eyes. Black ceiling beams. The air reeks of coal and machine oil. Something heavy and metallic is humming nearby. He takes a deep breath and starts coughing from the smoke. And then a line flashes before his eyes. Green letters right in the air. Innovator System active. Electronics. Rank D. It hangs there for 3 seconds and fades. Daniel blinks. He blinks again. An old man in a leather apron and round glasses with different lenses looms over him. One green, the other yellow. He looks at him like a dead rat on the doorstep. Mumbles that he found him by the back door with no ID and no license. Asks if he's even alive. Daniel sits down. His hands are intact. His legs are intact. His head is working. The last thing he remembers is the light of a truck's headlights on the windshield and the sound of the crash. Then nothing. And now, a stone floor, an old man in glasses, the smell of coal. He turns his head and freezes. A workshop from another century, workbenches with vices, copper pipes along the walls, brass gears and boxes. And right in front of him on a huge table stands a machine the size of a piano. Hundreds of gears. Cam levers. Cams. Levers. All made of brass and steel. The engineer's mind kicks in before fear sets in. An arithmetic machine. A mechanical calculator. Babbage built similar ones in the 19th century. Only this one works. And it calculates just like his first calculator. Only it weighs as much as 3,000 of those calculators. Daniel slips his hand into his pocket, and his fingers bump into a familiar rectangle. A multimeter. His working battery-powered digital multimeter, the very one that was in his jacket when the truck crashed into the car. He pulls out the device. The screen is lit. The battery is at 70%. Daniel exhales slowly. He puts the multimeter back. He looks at the old man, at the brass machine, at the copper haze outside the window. And he realizes where he is. And it seems he understands why. The old man's name is Orville Banks, Master Banks. He repairs computing machines in the lower quarter of the city of Brongate, the capital of the kingdom. Banks boils a kettle on a steam burner and talks non-stop. Brongate stands on cast-iron pillars above the coal mines. The sky here is always copper-colored from the smoke. Locomotives the size of houses run along the tracks. Aristocrats wear top hats with built-in barometers. The Great Steam Revolution erupted 200 years ago and has ruled everything ever since. Banks talks about it as if it were the weather. The tea is bitter and smells of smoke. But it's hot, and that's something. The old man asks who he is. Daniel replies that he doesn't remember. It's easier than the truth. Banks snorts. In the lower quarter, every other person doesn't remember who they are. Some from gin, some from a pipe to the head. The old man offers him a job as an apprentice. Room and food. Daniel agrees. He has nowhere else to go. No money, no papers, no understanding of how the world works outside the workshop walls. For the first 2 days, he watches. The system is silent. The green letters don't return. Daniel is already thinking it was a glitch in his dying brain, but his memory works with frightening clarity. He remembers everything. Every diagram. The 555 timer. The principles of zone silicon melting. Every lecture note from Stanford. Every data sheet from 7 years at the startup. Not a single failure. Not a single blank spot. He even remembers his student ID number.
A living person doesn't remember that. So the system is real. So the letters weren't a hallucination. He decides not to think about it for now. Survive first, figure it out later. Banks's workshop occupies 2 floors of a narrow brick house on an alley called Smoky Trail. Workbenches downstairs, living quarters upstairs. Banks lives there with his daughter, Kathleen, 22 years old, redhead, freckled, hands always covered in grease, a leather apron over a simple dress. She meets Daniel with a look that makes you want to check if his clothes are on fire. She asks her father why he drags every vagrant into the house. Banks replies that the guy is healthy and an extra pair of hands in the workshop is always useful.
Kathleen snorts and goes upstairs. The first evening, she doesn't say a word to him. The second one either. On the third day, she sets a bowl of porridge in front of him and mutters that if he gets food poisoning, it's not her fault. The porridge is hot and delicious. Daniel thinks it might be the best meal of his life. Kathleen catches him smiling and asks what's so funny. He says nothing. He just hasn't had home-cooked food in a long time. On the third day, a client arrives, an elderly woman in an expensive coat with a fur collar. Mrs. Hadley. She picks up the hearing tube that Banks has been repairing for the past 2 weeks. A large copper funnel with a diaphragm and resonators, a device for the deaf. Banks places the tube on the workbench and looks gloomy. The diaphragm works, the resonators are tuned perfectly, but in the noisy room, everything is drowned out by the din. Turn up the volume any further and the diaphragm whistles. Feedback. Daniel listens by the wall, and his mind is already working. Feedback. Amplification without filtering. The problem was solved in 1947 at Bell Labs, Bardeen and Bratton, the point contact transistor. His gaze sweeps over the workbench. Pieces of minerals lie scattered among the parts. Banks holds them as weights and stands. One gleams with a distinctive metallic sheen. Daniel grabs it, twirls it between his fingers. The system flashes. Germanium. Estimated purity 94%. Sufficient for a point contact diode. Recommendation. Purify by zone melting to 97%. Transistor structure construction possible. The letters fade. Daniel stands with a piece of germanium in his hand, his heart pounding. They use it as a decorative stone? As a paperweight? No one in this world knows it's a semiconductor. No one knows that this gray, unremarkable thing could turn everything upside down. He asks Banks if he can try something. The old man squints doubtfully. Kathleen calls out from her workbench that the newbie should first learn how to hold a file. Daniel ignores her. He asks for a scrap of germanium, a piece of copper wire, the thinnest needle, a speck of quartz, a small battery. Banks shrugs and hands them over. All just odds and ends lying around unused. Daniel sits down at a free workbench. The system is before his eyes again, and now it's drawing a diagram. Simple. Elegant. A point contact transistor. 2 electrodes on the surface of a germanium crystal. Base, emitter, collector. A single transistor amplifier. 2 resistors made of nichrome wire. A capacitor consisting of 2 copper plates with wax paper between them. All made from what lies on this workbench. Daniel gets to work. Banks returns to his tasks. Kathleen glances at him, but she says nothing. He had been working all evening. His hands remembered the movements. 7 years of working with circuit boards and components. Thousands of hours with a soldering iron. His fingers did what his brain commanded. First, he processed the germanium. He heated a small piece in a crucible over a burner. Not zone melting, of course, rough, but good enough for the first prototype. Then he sharpened a needle. Then he assembled the whole structure on a small wooden board. 2 conductors, a crystal, resistors made of wire wound around a ceramic rod, a capacitor made of copper plates, a battery, wires to the earpiece. The device turned out to be about the size of a snuff box. It was already dark when he finished. Banks was sitting at the table drinking tea.
Kathleen was reading something upstairs. Daniel connected the last wire and froze. If this didn't work, he was just a guy who'd spent half the evening fiddling with junk. If it works. He connected the battery. Nothing exploded. Nothing started smoking. He put on the earpiece from the hearing tube and tapped his fingernail on the table. The sound hit his eardrum so clearly and so loudly that he flinched. It works. A low-frequency transistor amplifier, the first in the history of this world, assembled from junk on a workbench. Daniel slowly took off the earpiece. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from realization. He had just leaped 200 years of technological development in a single evening. He called out to Banks. The old man approached reluctantly. Daniel held out the earpiece to him. He asked him to put it on and listen. Banks put it on. Daniel snapped his fingers at arm's length. Banks flinched. Daniel stepped back toward the door and tapped his fingernail against the doorframe. Quietly, barely audible. Banks turns to him, his mouth agape. Daniel whispered from the corner of the room, "Can you hear me, Master Banks?" The old man slowly took off his glasses. He wiped them, put them back on. He looked at the device, which was the size of a snuff box. He looked at Daniel. He took off the earpiece, put it back on. He listened to the clock ticking in the next room, through the wall. He took it off, placed it on the table, sat down, was silent. Then said that this wasn't a repair, it was a different kind of physics. He asked what this thing was and how Daniel knew how to make it. Daniel answered simply, "It's for Mrs. Hadley, so she can hear her grandson. The rest doesn't matter." Banks looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Then he stood up silently and went upstairs. On the stairs he stopped and said without turning around that they would discuss it in more detail tomorrow, and that Daniel shouldn't touch anything until morning. In the morning, Banks came downstairs earlier than usual. Daniel hadn't slept. He was sitting at the workbench, sketching diagrams on scraps of paper. The system had come to life again during the night and shown him a map of possibilities. The tree of technology. From the point diode upward, transistor, amplifier, generator, radio receiver, lamp. Each step required materials that had to be found in this world. Every step required hands. His hands. The system didn't create anything out of thin air. It only knew. Daniel had to do the work. Banks walked over and looked at the drawings. He asked what they were. Daniel began to explain. He picked up a mug from the table. He said, "Imagine a faucet. Water flows from a pipe, a thick pipe, lots of water. But you control it with a small valve. A slight movement of your finger and the flow changes. So this thing on the workbench is like that valve, only for electricity. A small current controls a large one." Banks listened. He frowned. Then his eyes widened. He silently went to get a notepad. 2 hours later, Mrs. Hadley came into the workshop. Banks inserted Daniel's device into the hearing tube's housing, almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Hadley put the tube on with a familiar gesture. Banks spoke to her in a normal voice, not shouting as usual. She replied. Then he spoke softly. She replied again. Then he switched to a whisper. She replied in a whisper. Mrs. Hadley froze. She looked at the hearing tube. She looked at Banks. She said she could hear the sign on the street creaking, that she could hear people's footsteps on the second floor,
that she hadn't heard so well in the last 15 years. Banks nodded toward Daniel. Mrs. Hadley turned to him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked his name. Daniel told her his name. She said she would remember it, and she left. Banks closed the door behind her. He turned to Daniel. He said that Mrs. Hadley was the wife of the Chamber of Commerce, and that in a week the whole upper city would know about his device. Daniel replied that he needed germanium, a lot of germanium. Banks asked why. Daniel said that the hearing tube was just the beginning. A line flashed before his eyes. Rank D confirmed. Proto 2 created. Prototype applied. Condition for promotion to rank C. Create a signal amplification device with a coefficient of at least 100 and apply it in the communications system. He deleted the line with a wave of his mind. He looked at Banks. He said this was only the beginning. Kathleen went down to the workshop after Mrs. Hadley had already left. She had seen from the window how the elderly woman was walking down the street and talking to her maid. In a normal voice, no shouting. For the first time in years, Kathleen looked at the device on the workbench, then at Daniel. She said nothing. But that day, for the first time, she served him tea without slamming the mug down on the table. The next morning, Daniel sat in the workshop basement, sifting through boxes of old parts. Banks had everything: scraps of wire, broken gears, pieces of miners that miners brought in to trade, glass tubes, shards of quartz. To the old man, it was junk. To Daniel, it was a warehouse of components. The system illuminated every object he picked up. Copper wire, resistance 0.017 ohms per meter with a cross-section of 1 square millimeter, suitable for windings. Quartz shards, dielectric constant 4.5, suitable for insulation. A piece of mica, an ideal capacitor dielectric. Wax paper, that'll work too. He sorted his finds into 3 piles. Useful now, useful later, useless. The third pile was the smallest. Banks came down to him an hour later. He brought tea and a slice of bread and butter. He sat down on an upside-down crate and said he'd been thinking all night. He hadn't slept at all. He wanted to understand exactly what Daniel had done yesterday. Not how, not from what, but what. What principle? Daniel set the box aside. He looked at the old man. This man had given him shelter and food. He hadn't asked unnecessary questions. He deserved honesty, at least partial honesty. Daniel said that in this world, all machines run on pressure. Steam pushes the piston turns the shaft turns the gear. Every step loses energy, every connection is friction. But there's another way to transmit signals and energy, through the movement of very small particles in certain materials. Electricity. Banks nodded. He knew about electricity, lightning, static, Leyden jars at the academy. But no one had ever taken him seriously, a hobby. Daniel said it wasn't a hobby, it was the next step. And this piece of gray stone that everyone here uses as a paperweight is the key to everything. He picked up a fragment of germanium. Banks looked closely at the stone, then at Daniel. He asked how he knew all this. Daniel paused. He said there were things he couldn't explain yet, but he could show the result. Banks nodded and said he'd already seen the result. Mrs. Hadley hears whispers. That's enough. The problem with germanium was the quantity. There were at most 50 grams of it in Banks's workshop. That was enough for a single transistor. For something serious, more was needed. The system suggested that germanium in this world was mined as a byproduct of silver mines. It was dumped in waste piles. Tons of the most valuable semiconductor lay in heaps of trash behind the mines, and no one knew what it was. The nearest silver mines were in Drefont, 300 kilometers. Far. But there was a closer option. In the lower quarter of Brongiat, there were dealers in ore scrap, slag and waste from the mines that were brought into the city for remelting. Among this slag, there was germanium, in small pieces, dirty but cleanable. Daniel asked Banks where to find such dealers. Banks gave him 3 addresses. Daniel asked him to lend him a little money. Banks sighed and handed over 3 copper coins. He said it was his daily earnings and told Daniel not to waste them on nonsense. The lower quarter of Brongiat turned out to be a labyrinth of narrow streets between the cast iron supports on which the upper city stood. It was dark here even during the day. The street lights ran on gas. Sewer ditches ran along the sidewalks. People in work jackets and boots walked quickly and avoided eye contact. Daniel followed the address and took in the city. Carpets, valves, pressure gauges on every corner. The city was literally breathing steam. White smoke poured from every crack. The thud of pistons echoed from every basement. He walked past a huge sign, Kran's House. Valves and pressure regulators, the best quality in the kingdom. 2 uniformed guards stood beneath the sign, the factory's private army. Daniel took note. The dealer's name was Grays, a fat man with sideburns and grease stains on his vest. He sat in a shop cluttered with chunks of ore, iron, copper, tin, lead, all mixed together. Daniel asked if he had any gray stone with a metallic sheen from the silver tailings. Grays rummaged in the corner and pulled out a bag. 10 pounds of dirty germanium. He called it scrap rock. Said nobody buys it, not even the smelters will take it. He named a price, half a coin for the whole bag. Daniel bought it without haggling. Grays looked at him like he was crazy. He asked why he wanted that junk. Daniel replied that it was for experiments. Grays snorted and said that if he needed more of that junk, he could get him 2 sacks a week. Daniel said he'd take whatever was available. Grays decided the guy was definitely out of his mind. But money is money. Daniel returned to the workshop with the sack on his back. Kathleen was standing in the doorway and looked at the sack. She asked what he'd brought. Stones. She asked why he needed stones. He replied that these stones could be used to make things she couldn't even imagine yet. Kathleen snorted and said that for now the only unimaginable thing in the workshop was his own conceit. Daniel smirked and went down to the basement. For the next 4 days, he built a germanium purification setup, zone melting. The principle is simple. The crystal is slowly drawn through a narrow heating zone. Impurities concentrate in the molten zone and shift toward the edge. Repeat several times, and the purity increases from 94 to 98%. In 21st century laboratories, this was done in a vacuum inside quartz tubes with precise temperature control. Daniel had neither a vacuum nor precise control, but the system adapted the method. Instead of a vacuum, use an argon atmosphere. There is no argon in this world. Fine. Instead of argon, use a reducing atmosphere. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is available. Water electrolysis. Electrolysis requires current. Current is available from Banks batteries. A quartz tube. Quartz is available. A heater. Nichrome wire wound around ceramic. There is no nichrome. But there is an alloy that Banks uses for springs, and its composition is similar. The system suggested the temperature range. Daniel built a furnace, small, crooked, wrapped in wire and coated with refractory clay. But it worked. The first batch yielded a piece of germanium the size of a thumbnail. Pure. The system confirmed it. 97.3%. Enough for transistors. Banks watched the process in silence. On the second day, he started helping, not because Daniel asked him to, but because he couldn't help himself. He was a master, a true master. His hands saw the problem before his eyes did. When Daniel couldn't secure the quartz tube in the right position, Banks made a brass clamp in 10 minutes that held it perfectly. When the wire heater burned out for the 3rd time, Banks suggested a different winding method that distributed the heat more evenly. He didn't understand exactly what they were doing, but he understood engineering problems, and he solved them with an elegance that made Daniel freeze in admiration every time. In another world, this old man would have been a professor, a chief engineer at a factory. Instead, he was repairing calculating machines in the basement. Kathleen also began going down to the basement, at first under the pretext of bringing tea, taking away dirty mugs, or checking to see if they'd set the house on fire. Then the excuses ran out, and she'd just stand in the doorway and watch. Daniel noticed that she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at his hands, at how he worked,
how he held the tools, how he soldered the joints, how he handled the small parts. She was an assembler. Banks had taught her to assemble mechanical computers, and she did it better than any apprentice in the neighborhood. But the guild didn't accept women. She couldn't get a license, couldn't open her own workshop, couldn't call herself a master. Only a master's daughter, an assistant,
An appendage. Daniel saw this and seethed in silence. In his world, the best engineers he knew were women. His advisor in grad school was a woman. Half the team at the startup were women. And here, a 22-year-old assembly genius was serving tea because she was the wrong gender. On the 7th day after creating the first transistor, Daniel had assembled 5 transistors, each one better than the last, cleaner contacts, more stable amplification. He laid them out on the workbench and looked at them as if they were his own children. 5 tiny devices on wooden platforms, each one the size of a coin, each capable of amplifying a weak signal hundreds of times. In a world where the smallest amplifier is a steam-powered servo mechanism weighing 20 kilograms. The system noted the progress. It displayed a new branch of the tree, a transistor generator, a quartz resonator, a radio frequency cascade, a receiver. He was on his way to making a radio. But first came practical matters. Money, food, supplies. Banks couldn't feed him indefinitely. Daniel needed to sell something. Mrs. Hadley's hearing aid yielded its first result sooner than he expected. On the 9th day, a man in an expensive frock coat came to the workshop. He introduced himself as Dr. Morris's secretary, the chief surgeon at St. Clark's Hospital in the Upper City. Dr. Morris had heard from Mrs. Hadley about the unusual device. He wanted to see it for himself. He was willing to pay for a demonstration. Banks looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. They agreed to meet the day after tomorrow. Daniel hadn't slept for 2 nights. He assembled a second hearing aid, better than the first, more compact, with volume control. A small brass lever on the casing. Turn it left to lower the volume, right to raise it. Simple, elegant. Kathleen helped him with the casing. He asked, and she didn't refuse. Her hands worked with the brass like a jeweler's. Precise cuts, perfect joints. Miniature hinges for the lid. Daniel watched, and for the 3rd time that week, thought that this girl was a genius whom no one saw. When the casing was ready, Kathleen set it on the table and looked at Daniel without hostility for the first time. She said the thing was beautiful, whatever she did. The demonstration with Dr. Morris took place in a hospital office, a large room with high ceilings, the smell of carbolic acid, anatomical posters on the walls. Morris turned out to be a thin man with a surgeon's long fingers and attentive eyes. He put on the device. Banks spoke in a whisper from the far corner of the room. Morris heard every word. Then Morris took off the device and asked questions for 20 minutes. How it works, on what principle, can it be made for different degrees of deafness, can it be made smaller, can it be made louder? Daniel answered patiently. Morris listened. Then he said that his hospital had 43 patients with varying degrees of hearing loss, and that he was ready to order 10 devices to start with. He named a price. Daniel nearly fell off his chair. For 10 devices, Morris was offering enough money to live on for 6 months. They left the hospital and stepped out onto the street. Brongate hummed and whistled around them. Steam-powered carriages crawled along the pavement. Factory chimneys streaked the sky gray. Banks walked in silence. Then he stopped. He looked at Daniel and said he didn't know who he was or where he came from, but that in 30 years in the trade, he'd never seen anything like it. And that if Daniel would let him, he didn't want to be just the workshop owner who let a vagrant spend the night. He wanted to be part of what was happening. Daniel held out his hand. Banks shook it, firmly. That evening, Daniel sat at the workbench and did the math. 10 devices. Each one needs 1 transistor, 2 resistors,
one capacitor, a battery, a case, wiring. The transistor is germanium. He has 10 pounds of it in a bag. That'll be enough. He can buy batteries from banks. He has 8 in stock. Kathleen will make the casings, if she agrees. He looked at the stairs. The light was on upstairs. He went up. Kathleen was sitting at a small table, sketching something in a notebook. She looked up. Daniel said he needed help. 10 casings for hearing aids, based on the blueprint he would provide. He would pay her out of Morris's money, as an engineer, not as an assistant, as an assembly engineer. Kathleen looked at him silently for 3 seconds. Then she told him to give her the drawing. For the next 3 weeks, the workshop on Smoky Trail operated like a small factory. Daniel melted and purified germanium. Banks ground parts and made jigs. Kathleen assembled the casings.
A rhythm established itself. Breakfast in the morning, then work until noon, lunch upstairs, work again until dark, dinner, and another 2 hours of work by the light of gas lamps. Daniel made 2 transistors a day. Out of 5 attempts, 3 yielded a working result. 2 were rejects. The percentage was poor by Earth standards, but there were no Earth standards here. Here, there was only him. Kathleen worked silently and precisely. Her casings were works of art. Brass walls fitted without gaps, covers on miniature hinges. The volume control moved smoothly with a soft click at each position. Daniel looked at her work and thought the same thing every time. A genius. A true genius of precision assembly. He told her this one evening when they were sitting at the workbench soldering the final connections on the 8th unit. He said she was the best assembler he'd ever seen. Kathleen didn't look up. She said he hadn't seen many assemblers. Daniel replied that he'd seen enough. She said nothing, but the tips of her ears turned red. The order for Morris was ready in 26 days. 10 devices in a wooden box lined with velvet, each in its own slot, each one tested, each with instructions that Daniel had written by hand. How to put it on, how to adjust it, how to change the battery. Morris picked up the order at the hospital. He examined each device, put one on, took it off, put on another, compared them, nodded, paid in full. Then he said he had a colleague, Dr. Turner from the military hospital, who wants to talk about something similar but for a different purpose. Daniel asked what purpose. Morris replied that Turner has soldiers with hearing damage from artillery fire, dozens of them. Daniel said he was ready to meet. The money from Morris changed everything. Daniel paid Banks for a month's room and board. He paid Kathleen for her work. He bought 3 more bags of germanium from Gray's. He bought tools, fine tweezers, a set of needles, magnifying glasses, the best blowtorch he could find in the neighborhood. The workshop began to change. Shelves with parts appeared on the walls. The workbenches were tidy. In the basement, the cleaning machine ran every day. But along with the money came attention. The neighbors on the alley were the first to notice, then the guild foreman of the lower quarter, then someone from the upper city. People started coming into the workshop, just to look, just to ask. What are you doing here? What's all that noise at night? Is it true that Banks is now making some kind of magical things? Banks answered evasively. Daniel tried to stay out of sight, but the rumors spread. On the 32nd day after Daniel's arrival, a man came to the workshop who changed the course of everything. Retired Artillery Colonel Edmund Hayworth. Tall, straight back, a gray mustache trimmed according to Army regulations, a scar on his left cheek, a heavy cane with a brass knob. He arrived unannounced. He knocked on the door with his cane. Banks opened it. The colonel introduced himself and said he had heard from Mrs. Hadley and Dr. Morris about a certain young man who was doing amazing things with electricity. He wanted to speak with this young man in person. Daniel emerged from the basement with his hands covered in soot. Colonel Hayworth looked him up and down.
He said he had expected someone older. Then he sat down in the only chair in the workshop and began to speak. He has a son, Captain William Hayworth. He serves in the mountain artillery on the eastern border.
There are skirmishes going on there right now with Sylvanian reconnaissance units. The problem is with the altimeters. The Army's steam altimeter weighs 6 kilograms. It needs to be heated for 20 minutes before use. In the mountains at low temperatures, it fails 1 out of every 3 times. The artillerymen are forced to estimate the altitude by eye. The shells miss their targets. People are dying. The colonel said that his son had written to him from his last campaign that he'd lost 2 men in his crew because the altimeter had frozen and they'd been firing blindly. He paused. Then he asked if Daniel could do anything. The system lit up instantly. A barometric altimeter on a transistor bridge amplifier. A pressure sensor made from a strain gauge. A strain gauge is a wire glued to a flexible substrate. Pressure bends the substrate. The wire stretches. The resistance changes. The bridge circuit converts the change in resistance into voltage. The transistor amplifier amplifies the signal. The pointer display shows the altitude. All on 5 transistors. Size, a pack of cigarettes. Weight, 200 grams. Time to build. Instantly. Daniel closed his eyes, opened them. Looked at the colonel, said he could do it. Said he needed 2 weeks and the finest quality thin steel wire he could find. The colonel took a notebook and a pencil from his pocket. He asked how much it would cost. Daniel named a sum equal to 2 Morris devices. The colonel didn't bat an eye. He said the money would be there tomorrow. The wire, too. 2 weeks. Daniel worked 16 hours a day. The strain gauge turned out to be the most difficult part. The wire had to be thin, even, glued to the backing without bubbles or wrinkles. The substrate had to be flexible yet sturdy. He tried 7 different materials before finding the right one. A thin mica plate coated with shellac. The steel wire was glued in a zigzag pattern, 10 turns per centimeter. Each turn even, each at the same distance from the previous one. His hands trembled from exhaustion by the end of each day, but in the morning they were precise again. Kathleen started asking questions, not about the result, about the process. Why the wire had to be zigzagged? Why mica and not paper? Why 5 transistors and not 3? Daniel explained, every time, patiently. The zigzag increases the wire length per unit area. Greater length means higher sensitivity. Mica is more stable under temperature fluctuations. 5 transistors because 2 are in the bridge amplifier, 2 in the compensation stage, and 1 at the output. Kathleen listened, nodded, asked the next question. Daniel noticed how she would later sit alone and sketch in her notebook, redrawing his schematics, adding her own notes, trying to understand not only what he was doing, but also why. On the 12th day, the altimeter was ready. A small brass case, Kathleen's handiwork. A round dial with a pointer, 3 buttons, power, calibration to current altitude, reset. Daniel turned it in the workshop. The needle settled at the mark. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The needle shifted. A 3-meter difference. Spot on. He went out onto the roof. The needle showed 8 meters above the workshop level. He went back down. The needle returned to 0. It works. Colonel Hayworth arrived the next day. Daniel placed the altimeter in his palm. The colonel looked at the device, then at his own palm. The Army altimeter he'd seen 1,000 times had to be carried in a wooden box with straps. This one lay in his palm like a watch. The colonel turned it on. The needle stood still. He raised the device above his head. The needle moved. He lowered it. The needle returned. He silently put it in his pocket. He took out his wallet. He paid. Then he said he would send the device to his son on the very next train, and that he would return in a month with an order for 5 units, if the device could withstand mountain conditions. He left. Banks watched him go and quietly told Daniel that he had just gained a patron from the military, that this was both very good and very dangerous. The system responded that very night. Green lines before his eyes. Device activated. Barometric altimeter on a transistor bridge amplifier. Practical use confirmed. Progress toward rank C, 40%. Condition. Create a device for receiving electromagnetic signals. Daniel lay on a narrow cot in a small room next to the basement and stared at the ceiling. A radio receiver. The next step. He closed his eyes and let the system show him the schematic. A detector receiver, the simplest kind. Antenna. An oscillating circuit consisting of an inductor and a capacitor. A detector based on a germanium diode. An earpiece. No batteries.
It runs on the energy of the radio signal itself. Back on Earth, boys used to build these from magazines. Only here, there are no radio signals. Or maybe there are, the system suggested. In this world, the military use spark transmitters for Morse code. Crude. Powerful. They run on steam generators. The frequency isn't stable, but there is a signal. Military towers along the coast transmit codes every half hour. If he could build a receiver and pick up that signal, it would be proof. Proof that electromagnetic waves could be received without a steam engine the size of a room. With a device that fits in the palm of his hand, Daniel got started the next day. An inductor made of copper wire wound around a cardboard cylinder. A variable capacitor consisting of two plates that can be moved relative to each other. A diode. A needlepoint contact on a germanium crystal. An earpiece from a hearing aid. An antenna. 10 meters of copper wire stretched from the workshop roof to a cast iron support in the upper town. Banks helped with the antenna. Kathleen stood below and watched as they climbed across the roof in the dark. Daniel plugged in the earpiece. He turned the capacitor. Noise. Crackling. Static. He turned it some more, and suddenly a signal broke through the crackling. Dot dash. Dot dot dash. Dash dash dot. Morse code. A military signal from the coastal tower, clear, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Daniel froze. Then he slowly took off the earpiece and handed it to Banks. The old man put it on, listened, turned pale, took it off, put it on again, listened, took it off, looked at Daniel, looked at the little box on the table, from which a wire ran to the earpiece, and a wire to the wire on the roof. No boiler, no steam, no pressure, just a box and a wire, and a military code from the air. Banks sat down in a chair. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that this changed everything. Absolutely everything. Kathleen stood in the doorway. She saw her father's face. She had never seen him like this. She walked over, took the earpiece, put it on. She heard it. Dot dash. Dot dot dash. A sound from the air. No wires from a source. No machine. No steam. She took off the earpiece. She looked at Daniel. There was something new in her eyes. Not hostility, not suspicion. Fear. She asked quietly, "What are you?" Daniel replied that he was an engineer, just an engineer. The next morning, Daniel woke up to a knock. Someone was pounding on the workshop door. It was still dark. He climbed out of his bunk and opened it. Standing on the threshold was a boy of about 12 in a uniform jacket with brass buttons. A messenger. He held out an envelope sealed with wax. He said it was from Dr. Turner at the military hospital. He was waiting for a reply. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a short note. Dr. Turner invited him to the hospital on Calvert Street at noon today. He wanted to discuss a possible order. Daniel wrote on the back that he would be there. He gave the boy a coin. The boy ran off. The military hospital on Calvert Street turned out to be a long stone building with cast iron columns and smoking chimneys on the roof. Steam heating, steam ventilation, steam sterilization of instruments, everything steam-powered.
Dr. Turner was waiting for him in his office on the second floor, a large man with a beard and tired eyes. He shook Daniel's hand and got straight to the point. He had 80 soldiers with hearing damage from artillery fire, concussions. Their eardrums were intact, but their inner ears had been damaged. Regular hearing tubes are useless. Something more powerful is needed. Could Daniel help? Daniel asked if he could examine the patients. Turner nodded and led him into the ward. The ward was long and low. 20 beds in a row, men in gray hospital gowns. Some were sitting, some were lying down. Many had bandages on their heads. Silence. A strange silence for a room with 20 people. Daniel realized why. They weren't talking, because they couldn't hear each other. He walked over to the nearest bed, a young guy, about 20 years old, broad shoulders, a vacant stare. Turner said this was Corporal Burns. He'd been a gunner in a heavy battery, a 6-inch howitzer, 3 years on the front lines. Now he couldn't hear anything quieter than a shout at arm's length. Daniel crouched down next to the cot. He looked the corporal in the eyes. The corporal stared back at him blankly. Daniel raised his hand and waved slowly. The corporal nodded. Turner said he wasn't completely deaf. He had residual hearing, but it was very weak. Standard amplifiers couldn't handle it. The system had already analyzed it. Sensory neural hearing loss. The hair cells in the cochlea are damaged, partially. Dynamic range compression is needed. Quiet sounds need to be amplified strongly. Loud sounds, weakly. On Earth, this was called a compressor. Automatic gain control. The circuit is more complex than a simple amplifier. 3 transistors per amplifier stage, 2 for the feedback loop that controls the gain. A total of at least 7 transistors, plus filters for frequency separation. Turner said the Department of Defense is willing to pay well, but we need results not in a month, but in 2 weeks. The first batch, at least 5 units. Daniel returned to the workshop and laid out the schematic on the workbench. 7 transistors per unit, 5 units, 35 transistors. At his current yield rate, he'd need to make about 60 to get 35 working ones. 60 transistors in 2 weeks, 4 a day. He'd been making 2 a day before and was so exhausted his hands were shaking. Banks looked at him and said it was impossible to do alone. Daniel replied that he knew, that he needed help. He looked at Kathleen. Kathleen looked back at him. She said she didn't know how to make his transistors. Daniel replied that he would teach her. For the next 3 days, he taught Kathleen how to make transistors, from scratch. He started with the theory, what a semiconductor is, how current flows through a crystal, what happens when a needle touches the surface. He explained it using his fingers. Imagine a square full of people. Everyone is standing tightly packed together. No one can move. That's an insulator. Now imagine that a few people have been removed. Holes have appeared. The people next to the gaps can shift. The gaps start to move. That's a semiconductor. Now imagine you're standing at the edge of the square and can use a thin stick to nudge people in the right direction. One light touch and the crowd starts to flow. That's a transistor. A small effort controls a large flow. Kathleen listened. She frowned. She asked questions. He repeated himself. She frowned again. Then her eyes widened. She understood. Daniel saw that moment, the moment when an idea sinks in and the world becomes different for a person. He knew that moment. It was worth being an engineer for that moment. Kathleen's hands turned out to be better than his. After 2 days of practice, she made the needle contact on the crystal more precisely than he did. Her yield rate by the end of the first week was 70%. Daniel's was 60. He wasn't surprised. He had foreseen it. She was a natural assembler, fine motor skills on par with a surgeon, a patience he couldn't replicate. She could sit over a crystal for 2 hours without moving and place the needle exactly where it needed to be. Daniel showed her where.
She placed it, without a miss. By the end of the 10th day, they had 42 working transistors, enough for 5 devices with some to spare. Daniel assembled the circuits. Kathleen made the casings. Banks filed down the small parts and prepared the tools. The 3 of them worked together, and for the first time, it felt like a team. Not a master and apprentices, a team. The devices for the military hospital were ready on the 13th day. Daniel personally delivered them to Turner. The doctor placed the first device on Corporal Burns. He sat on the cot with a blank expression. Turner turned on the device. He waited a second. Then he said in his usual voice, "Corporal Burns, how are you feeling?"
Burns jerked so violently he nearly fell off the cot. His eyes grew huge. He turned his head. He looked at Turner, then at Daniel, then at the window beyond which the street was noisy. He could hear the street. For the first time in a year and a half, he opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, said quietly and hoarsely that he could hear. The soldier on the next bunk turned around. Burns turned toward him and said he could hear him. Hear. His neighbor stared at him blankly. Turner walked over to the next bunk and put on the second device, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. 5 men who had lived in silence for a year and a half suddenly spoke at the same time. The ward buzzed with voices. Someone was laughing. Someone was just repeating words, any words, testing. I hear. I can hear. I hear. Daniel stood by the wall and watched. He remembered why he was doing all this. Not for the money, not for the system, not for the ranks. For this. For the moment when a person becomes whole again. Turner came up to him afterward, shook his hand, firmly. Said he'd order 30 more, that he'd write a report to the War Department. That Daniel had no idea what he'd just set in motion. Daniel did have an idea, and that was exactly what scared him. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the workshop. Banks had gone to bed, Kathleen too. He sat and thought. 30 units. That's at least 120 transistors. With a 60% yield, he'd need to make 200. With just Kathleen, that's a month of non-stop work. Impossible. He needed more people. He needed space. He needed equipment. He needed a real workshop, not a basement with a single stove. He pulled a multimeter out of his pocket. The battery was at 52%. In a few months, it would die, and the only device from his past life would turn into a useless piece of plastic. He needed to make his own. An analog one, with transistors, with a galvanometer. It's possible, but not now. Right now, he needs to think about scaling up. The reply came 4 days later, from an unexpected source. There was a knock at the workshop door. Daniel opened it. A girl was standing on the threshold, about 19 years old, tall, dark hair tucked under a simple hat. Her posture was straight, too straight for the lower quarter. Her clothes were simple, but the fabric was expensive. Her hands were callus-free. She said she was looking for work. She could draw. She'd studied at the academy. She introduced herself as Evie Tara. She said she'd seen the ad Daniel had posted at the tea shop on the corner. Daniel had indeed posted the ad 2 days ago. Seeking an assistant, needed a steady hand and a patient disposition. Payment based on results. He looked at the girl. Something wasn't right. Her clothes said one thing, her manners another, her hands a third. She wasn't who she claimed to be, but he needed people, and she knew how to draw. He asked if she could show him. She pulled a folder out of her bag. Drawings. Perfect. The lines were drawn with a precision that comes only after years of training under the best masters. The scaling was flawless. The dimensions were marked in a system Daniel recognized as academic. Not guild style. Academic. Higher education. Daniel looked at the drawings. He looked at her. He said he'd take her on, starting tomorrow.
She nodded. A shadow of something flashed in her eyes. Relief, or fear, or both. Kathleen greeted Evie in silence. She looked her up and down.
Then she turned away and went back to work. That evening she told Daniel that the girl was lying, that she wasn't Tara at all, that her posture and manners were from the upper city, from the very top. Daniel replied that he knew. Kathleen asked if he was still going to hire her. Daniel said he needed someone who knew how to draw. She knew how to draw. The rest was her business. Kathleen snorted. She said he was a naive idiot. She went upstairs. A.V. Tara arrived the next morning at exactly 7. She took off her hat. She hung up her coat. She asked what to do. Daniel gave her a task, to redraw his working diagrams for the amplifier and altimeter in final form, with dimensions, with material specifications, with tolerances. She worked in silence, quickly, precisely. By lunchtime, the 2 diagrams were ready. Daniel looked them over and didn't find a single mistake. Not one. He nodded, said they were good, gave her the next assignment. She worked until evening. As she was leaving, she said quietly that she was grateful for the opportunity. Daniel replied that gratitude wasn't needed, accuracy was. She almost smiled. Almost. A week later, Evie had become an indispensable part of the workshop. She drew schematics, kept records, calculated material usage, started a ledger, organized the parts warehouse. Daniel noticed she had management skills, skills that drafters aren't taught, skills taught to the heirs of trading houses. He said nothing. Banks noticed too. He said nothing either. Kathleen pointedly ignored her existence. By the end of the 2nd month in the world of Averton, Daniel was taking stock. He had a workshop, a team of 4 people, orders from 2 hospitals, a patron in the form of Colonel Hayworth, the skills to manufacture transistors and simple electronic devices, money to last several months, a detector radio that picks up Morse code, and the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something that would soon attract the attention of people he'd be better off not attracting. Banks had told him that very over tea one evening that there were no secrets in Brongate, that sooner or later the great houses would find out, and that when they did, a whole different game would begin. The 3rd month began with the problem Daniel had been expecting. The Guild, an official letter on heavy paper with a wax seal. Banks' workshop was to be inspected at the request of an anonymous complainant. The grounds. The production of devices lacking a patent classification, operating without a guild certificate for a new type of product. The inspection is scheduled for 3 days from now. Banks read the letter and set it down on the table. The old man's hands trembled slightly. He explained that the guild was not merely a trade union. The Brongate Guild of Engineers and Mechanics controls all technical production in the city. Every device must have a patent classification. Steam engine, Class A. Mechanical calculator, Class B. Pressure regulator, Class C, and so on. Everything is laid out, everything is accounted for. The devices Daniel makes don't fit into any class. They aren't steam-powered, they aren't mechanical, they aren't pneumatic. It's not even clear what they are. And if it's not clear what they are, that means they're illegal. Daniel asked what would happen if an inspection found violations. Banks replied quietly. A fine, confiscation of equipment, closure of the workshop, in the worst case, prison for illegal manufacturing. Banks had paid guild dues for 20 years, 20 years of an impeccable reputation. One tip-off, and everything could come crashing down. Kathleen stood by the wall and listened with a stony face. Evie sat at the table and turned noticeably pale. Daniel looked at them. He looked at the letter. He asked who could have written the tip-off. Banks shrugged. Anyone. A competitor, a neighbor, a jealous rival, or someone from the upper city who'd heard rumors. 3 days. Daniel thought for 12 hours. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't hide it. He would show it.
but he would show it in such a way that the inspector couldn't classify it as a violation. He called Banks and Kathleen over. He explained the plan. Every device in the workshop would be registered as an improvement on an existing class. A hearing aid, that's Class F. Medical acoustic devices, it's an improvement. An altimeter, Class D. Navigation and measuring instruments, an improvement. A radio receiver. We need to get rid of it, completely. There is no classification for it, and there never will be. We'll hide the receiver. We'll remove the antenna. Banks nodded. Got it.
Kathleen began rearranging the equipment in the workshop. Without a word, Evie rewrote the ledgers so that all devices were recorded under existing guild categories. Daniel watched as Evie worked on the documents, quickly, confidently. She knew the bureaucratic system better than Banks. She knew what wording the guild charter allowed. She knew how to describe a device so that it formally fell into the right class. These weren't the skills of a draftsman. These were the skills of a person who had grown up among patent lawyers and guild advisors. Daniel looked at her. She felt his gaze. She raised her head. Their eyes met. She realized he understood. He saw it in her face. A momentary fear. Then determination. She returned to the documents and said nothing. The inspector arrived exactly on the appointed day, a second-rank guild inspector. A short man in a tight-fitting frock coat with shiny buttons and a briefcase stuffed with papers. He introduced himself as Inspector Moody. He walked around the workshop, peered into every corner, opened every drawer. Banks followed him and answered questions calmly. 20 years of experience. Inspector Moody stopped in front of the workbench where 3 finished hearing aids lay. He picked one up, turned it over, asked what it was. Banks replied that it was a Class F medical acoustic device, an advanced hearing tube with an improved sound amplification system. The inspector frowned. He opened the cover. Inside were transistors, resistors, wires, nothing resembling a diaphragm or a resonator. He asked where the steam element was, where was the pressure. Banks replied that the device ran on an electrochemical cell, a battery. The inspector stared at the battery, then at Banks. He asked where the boiler was. Banks patiently explained that there was no boiler. The electrochemical cell generates current without heat and without pressure. Inspector Moody stood in the middle of the workshop with the device in his hand and the expression of a man who had just discovered that the floor beneath him didn't exist. He flipped through his reference book, a thick book in a leather. The Kingdom's Classification of Technical Devices, 12th edition. He flipped through it from beginning to end, then back, then again. There was no device in the handbook that operated without steam, without pneumatics, and without mechanical parts. At all. The category didn't exist. Inspector Moody closed the handbook, opened it again, closed it, looked at Banks, looked at the device. He said that technically he couldn't issue a ticket for a device that didn't exist in the classification, because a ticket is issued for a violation of a specific clause, and there is no clause, because the device doesn't exist. But here it is. He's holding it in his hand. It exists, but it doesn't. Inspector Moody looked like a man who was starting to get a headache. He said he would write a report and send a request to the Guild's Central Committee to create a new classification category, that it would take 6 to 8 months. Until a response is received, the workshop may continue its work provided that all devices are registered as experimental. He signed the paper. He stamped it. He left. Banks closed the door behind him. He turned to Daniel, and for the first time ever, he laughed. He laughed for real, until he cried. Kathleen did too. Even Evie smiled. Daniel stood there thinking he'd just won 6 months. 6 months while the bureaucratic machine chews over what it can't understand. 6 months to become big enough and important enough that when the classification finally arrived, he would have something to say in response. But he knew the tip-off hadn't come by accident. Someone had set the guild on him. Someone who didn't like what was happening. And that someone wouldn't stop at just one inspector.
A week after the inspection, Daniel decided it was time to take the next step. Radio. Not a detector receiver picking up Morse code. A real tube radio capable of receiving voices and music. For that, he needed an amplifier more powerful than a transistor one. The transistors he made were good for low frequencies, for sound, but radio frequencies required something else. The system suggested two paths. The first, learn how to make high-frequency transistors. Difficult, requires germanium purity above 99%. The second path, a tube, an electronic tube, a vacuum triode, a glass bulb with 3 electrodes inside. The cathode emits electrons, the anode collects them. The grid between them controls the flow. The same principle as a transistor.
A small signal on the grid controls a large current between the cathode and anode, but the tube works at any frequency, from audio to radio. And it's easier to make than a high-frequency transistor. There's one problem: the vacuum. You need a glass bulb from which the air has been pumped out. In a world where there are glass blowers but no vacuum pumps. Or maybe there are. The system suggested a solution: Sprengel's mercury vacuum pump. Invented on Earth in 1865. A simple design, mercury flows down a tube and traps air molecules, slowly but effectively. There is mercury on Averton. It's used in barometers and manometers. There are glass tubes. There are glass blowers. Everything is here. We just need to put it together. Daniel drew a diagram of the pump and showed it to Banks. The old man studied it for a long time. Then he said he knew a glass blower on Latany Lane. A good craftsman. He makes labware for the academy. He can blow any shape out of glass. Daniel said, "Great. We'll go see him tomorrow." The glass blower, Fabian, turned out to be a thin, quiet man with scorched fingers and surprisingly kind eyes. He listened to Daniel. He looked at the drawing. He asked why they needed to pump air out of a glass tube. Daniel explained, "If you remove the air, the electrons will be able to travel from one electrode to the other without interference." Fabian asked what electrons were. Daniel stumbled. Then he said they were like very small invisible balls that carry an electric current. Fabian thought for a moment and said he understood. Not the electrons, but what they needed from them. A vacuum inside the glass. That he could do. 2 days later, Daniel had a set of glass flasks, small, neat, with soldered wire leads. Fabian worked like an artist. Each flask was a work of art. Daniel assembled the mercury pump in a day, slow, painstaking work. Glass tubes connected via rubber adapters, a reservoir of mercury at the top, an outlet tube at the bottom. The principle was simple. The mercury drips, it traps air. The air escapes. A vacuum remains. The first attempt failed, a leak in the connection. The second one, too. The tube burst. The third one worked. The pump started working, slowly. Pumping down a single flask took 4 hours. But the vacuum inside was deep enough. Daniel assembled his first lamp on the 5th day. The cathode was made of tungsten wire coated with barium oxide for better electron emission. He found the barium oxide at a pharmacy. The tungsten wire came from a jeweler. The anode was a nickel plate. The grid was made of thin copper wire wound into a spiral. Everything was soldered into a Fabian glass flask. The air was pumped out with a mercury pump, sealed. Daniel connected the battery to the cathode. He applied voltage to the anode. The filament glowed a dull red. He applied a signal to the grid. He measured the output current. Amplification. It works. Vacuum triode, the first electronic tube in Averton's history. The system responded immediately. Vacuum triode, amplification confirmed. Progress toward rank C, 70%. Recommendation: build a result capable of demodulating an amplitude-modulated signal. Daniel smiled. The system wanted a radio. So did he. For the next 2 weeks, he built a receiver.
A tube superheterodyne. No, too complicated for a first attempt. A direct amplification receiver. An antenna. An input circuit. A tube radio frequency amplifier. A detector. An audio frequency amplifier. A speaker. No speaker. He needed headphones or a loudspeaker.
A loudspeaker, a cone made of thick paper glued to a wire coil. The coil hangs in the magnetic field of a permanent magnet. The current in the coil causes the cone to vibrate. Sound. A simple electrodynamic loudspeaker. Banks has a magnet. He has paper. He has wire. He assembled a receiver in a wooden case. 2 tubes, one for amplification, one for detection, powered by 4 batteries. An antenna on the roof, a fabric grill in front of the loudspeaker. He turned it on. There was static. He turned the tuning knob. Morse code. He had heard it before. He turned it further. And suddenly, a voice. A human voice. Hoarse, distorted, but a voice. Someone was dictating numbers, coordinates, military communications, amplitude modulation on the carrier frequency, rough but sufficient to transmit a voice. Averton's military had already been using voice radio. Only their transmitters took up an entire room and ran on steam generators. And he was listening to them through a box the size of a book. Daniel took off his headphones. He switched to speakerphone. A voice filled the room. Quiet, hoarse, but audible. He called everyone over. Banks came first, then Kathleen, then Evie. They stood around the table and listened to the voice coming from the wooden box. Banks sat down and listened in silence. Kathleen stood with her mouth open. Then she closed it. Then she opened it again. Then she quietly asked who was inside. Daniel couldn't help it and laughed. There's no one inside. It's radio waves. The voice is transmitted through the air, without wires. Kathleen looked at the box. She looked at Daniel. She said he was lying, that there was someone inside, a little person. Daniel took off the lid and showed her the insides. 2 tubes, wires, capacitors, coils. Not a single little person. Kathleen stared at the tubes, the dim red glow of the filaments, then back at Daniel. Then she sat down next to her father and just listened. Avi stood a little to the side. Her face was pale. She listened to the voice coming from the box, and Daniel could see that she understood. Not the physics, not the circuitry. She understood what this meant. For the world, for the government, for the great houses. She had grown up among people who built empires on controlling information, on the fact that an order from the capital takes a week to reach the border, on the fact that news traveled at the speed of a horse. And now, right in front of her, was a box from which a voice from another city sounded instantly. She looked up at Daniel. In her eyes was the same question Kathleen had asked a week ago. Who are you? Only Evie didn't ask it out loud. She just looked. The system lit up at night when everyone had left. Rank C achieved. AM signal demodulation register. Application confirmed. New capabilities unlocked. Low-order integrated circuits. Transmitters. Communication systems. Daniel lay in the dark, staring at the green letters. Rank C. 2 ranks in 3 months. Not because he's a genius, because this world is hungry. Hungry for technology that works. Every device he made found someone who needed it. Every transistor, every tube, every circuit solved someone's problem. And the system counted that, not patents, not profit. People. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow he needed to think about how to make a transmitter. If it could receive a signal, it could send one too. 2-way communication. A radio, portable, the size of a suitcase, not a room. Then a briefcase. Then the size of a book. He knew the path. He'd walked it once before. In textbooks, in lectures, in the lab. Only now it wasn't a textbook. It was the real world with real people. And every step along this path brought closer the moment when the people up there would notice. Really notice. And come.
The fourth month in Averton began with a letter from Colonel Hayward, short, dry, written in military handwriting. The altimeter had passed its tests in the mountains. Captain William Hayworth had used it in 3 artillery operations. Guidance accuracy had tripled. 0 losses in the calculations. The colonel was ordering 5 units, and he added a note at the bottom saying he'd passed on the information about Daniel to someone at the War Department. No names, just passed it on. Daniel read the letter twice, set it aside. He looked at Banks. The old man was drinking tea and pretending not to listen. Daniel told him that the military would be coming soon. For real. Banks nodded. He said it had been inevitable from the moment the shell-shocked soldiers started hearing things. The workshop on Smoky Trail was getting cramped. 4 people were working in a space meant for 1. The workbenches were packed together. Parts lay on the windowsills. The germanium purification setup took up the entire basement. Glass lamp bulbs were stored in boxes under the stairs. They needed a new place. Daniel counted the money. The orders from Morris and Turner had brought in enough to rent a space. Small, but separate. Banks suggested checking out a former carriage workshop on Latania Street, 2 blocks away from them. The owner had gone bankrupt when steam-powered carriages replaced horse-drawn ones. It had been empty for 6 months. Daniel went to take a look. The building was perfect. A large hall with a high ceiling, stone floor, 3 windows, a back room for storage, a small courtyard, a basement with thick walls. The roof was intact, the door was sturdy, the rent was reasonable. Daniel signed the lease that same day. Banks kept his workshop for small orders and moved with Daniel to the new location. Kathleen too. Evie too. The first week they set up. They set up workbenches. They ran wiring for the lights. They built a second furnace for germanium. They installed shelves. Evie organized the inventory with German precision. Every item in its place. Every tool labeled. Every expense recorded. On the 3rd day in the new workshop, Daniel decided it was time to talk to Evie. That evening, after Banks and Kathleen had left, he asked her to stay behind. She grew wary. He saw her shoulders tense. He spoke plainly. He knows she isn't Evie Tara. He knows she's from the upper city. He knows she has an academy education and the skills to run a trading house. He wasn't asking who she really was. It didn't matter to him. But he needed to know one thing. Was she here because she was spying on him, or because she was running from something? Evie was silent. For a long time. A minute or 2. Then she spoke. Quietly. Steadily. Without tears and without a tremor in her voice. She said her real name was Evelyn Kranz, daughter of Lord Augustus Kranz. Yes, that very Kranz. House Kranz. Valves and pressure regulators. She ran away 2 months ago. Her father had decided to marry her off to Baron Stafford. 61 years old. A widower. A mine owner. A merger of patents through a marriage contract. She refused. Her father said that no one cared about her opinion. She left at night through a 2nd-story window. She took only her clothes and a folder of blueprints with her. She's staying with a friend who doesn't ask questions. She works for Daniel because it's the only place where she doesn't need a last name. Just her hands and her head. Daniel listened. Then he nodded. He said nothing would change. She's staying. She's Evie, not Krantz. Evie looked at him. There was so much in her eyes that Daniel looked away first. She said quietly that he didn't understand. Her father would find out, sooner or later. And when he did, he wouldn't come just for her. He'd come for everyone. Daniel replied that when that day came, they'd deal with it, but for now, he had to deliver 5 altimeters to Colonel Hayworth tomorrow, and he needed a draftsman. Evie exhaled softly. She almost smiled. She nodded. She left. Daniel sat alone in the empty workshop, thinking. The Krantz house. His main competitor, whom he hadn't even met yet. And this man's daughter works for him, draws his blueprints, knows his secrets, knows about germanium, about transistors, about tubes, about radio. If she's a spy, then he's already lost. But she isn't a spy. He had seen her eyes when she spoke of Baron Stafford. It was genuine fear, genuine anger, genuine pain. She wasn't acting.
She was running, and she had run to him. He took a multimeter out of his pocket. The battery was at 41%. Time was running out. He had to hurry. The 5th month brought 2 events that changed everything. First, a woman came into the workshop, young, men's pants, a pipe, short hair, a notepad in her hand. She introduced herself as Min-Soo Jung, editor-in-chief of a publication called Brongate Prometheus. She said she was writing an article about Master Banks and his mysterious devices. She wanted an interview. Banks waved his hands and said it wasn't him. He pointed at Daniel. Min-Soo turned to him. She looked him up and down. She took out a pencil. She asked if it was true that he made devices that restored hearing to the deaf. Daniel replied that it was true. She asked how. He began to explain. 5 minutes, 10, 20. Min-Soo listened without interrupting. She took notes. An hour later, she asked a question that made him fall silent. She asked if he realized that his inventions rendered half of the great house's products obsolete. And if he did he have a plan for when they realized it? Daniel didn't answer right away. He said his plan was simple. To make things that people need, to make them well, to make them affordable, and to hope that the benefits would outweigh the fear. Min-Soo looked at him for a long time. Then she closed her notebook. She said she would write an article, an honest one, without embellishment and without attacks, and that if the article were published, there would be no turning back. Daniel nodded. Min-Soo left. The second event happened a week later. An elderly woman came into the workshop with a girl. No, not a girl. A young woman. 17 years old. Quiet, eyes downcast, hands folded in her lap. The elderly woman turned out to be Mrs. Hadley, the very same one, the first client. She had brought her granddaughter, Ayla. Ayla Hadley, deaf from birth. Mrs. Hadley spoke while Ayla sat motionless, staring at the floor. Mrs. Hadley said her granddaughter had never heard a single sound, not a voice, not music, not the wind. That the doctors said it was incurable. That hearing aids were useless. She asked if Daniel could do anything. Daniel looked at Ayla. The girl looked up. Brown eyes, large, calm. Not pleading, not pitiful. Just calm. She was used to the silence. She had lived in it for 17 years. She didn't know what she was missing, and that was what hurt Daniel the most. He sat down next to her, took out a slate, wrote, "I am Daniel. I will try to help. It will take time." Ayla read it. She wrote a reply in neat handwriting. "I know many people make promises. You are the first one Grandma trusts." Daniel looked at her words, then at her, then at Mrs. Hadley. He said he needed to examine Ayla at Dr. Morris's office, that he needed to determine the type of hearing loss, and that he wasn't promising anything, but he would try. Morris examined Ayla the next day. The diagnosis confirmed what the system had indicated: severe congenital sensory neural hearing loss. The hair cells of the cochlea are underdeveloped. The auditory nerve is intact. The brain is capable of processing the signal if it reaches it. A standard hearing aid is useless because there is nothing to amplify. The link between the sound wave and the nerve impulse is damaged. The system presented a solution. Not a simple one, not a quick one, but a possible one. A bone vibrator. Sound is transmitted not through the air and not through the eardrum, but through the bones of the skull directly to the cochlea. Such devices existed on Earth as early as the 20th century. An electromagnetic vibrator is pressed against the mastoid process behind the ear. The vibration is transmitted through the bone. The cochlea responds. The nerve transmits the signal to the brain. Ayla needs an amplifier with high gain and compression.
plus a special frequency profile tailored to her specific type of hearing loss. This isn't a job for a day or a week. It's a job for months. Daniel got started, alongside his other orders, alongside production, in the evenings and at night. He designed the device for Ayla as the most important thing in his life, because she was the most important thing. The system didn't get in the way. The system helped. It displayed frequency characteristics. It suggested filter parameters. It calculated the vibrator's power. Daniel worked and thought that if he could give hearing to a girl who had never heard, that would be proof. Not for the guild, not for the military, not for the great houses, for himself. Proof that he wasn't here in vain. Minsu's article came out 2 weeks later. The Brongate Prometheus printed a run of 3,000 copies.
For an underground leaflet, that was a lot. The article was titled differently than Minsu had originally planned. Not an exposé, not a scandal. She titled it simply, "A New Light from the Lower Quarter." She wrote about hearing aids, about soldiers who could hear again, about altimeters for artillerymen, about a radio receiver that picked up voices from the air. Not a single name except Banks. She referred to Daniel as Master Banks's apprentice. No details about the technology, no addresses, only results. Only people who were better off. Minsu knew how to write. Every sentence hit the mark. Daniel read the article and thought that this woman was more dangerous than any weapon he could invent. The reaction came quickly. 3 days after publication, the first stranger appeared at the workshop. He stood across the street. He watched. He left. The next day, 2. They stood there too. They watched too. Banks noticed. He told Daniel. Daniel looked out the window. 2 men in dark coats. Not from the lower quarter. Expensive shoes, well-tailored coats. Upper city. They weren't hiding, just watching. Then they left. A week later, a second letter arrived from the guild. This time, not an inspection. A summons to a hearing before the Guild Council regarding the creation of a new patent category. Attendance is mandatory. The date is in 10 days. Banks read it and turned pale. The Guild Council isn't Inspector Moody with his handbook. It's 12 master craftsmen of the highest rank. Half of them are appointed by the great houses, and they decide who can work and who cannot. 10 days until the hearing. Daniel prepared in 2 ways simultaneously. The first way, legal. Eva sat down with the documents and in 2 days put together a folder as thick as a finger. Every device was described. Every operating principle was explained in terms the Guild Council could understand. She used analogies with steam systems. A transistor is a new type of valve. An electric current is pressure in a conductor. An amplifier is a lever that increases a small force. A capacitor is a receiver for electrical pressure. Each comparison was technically crude, but legally flawless. If a transistor is a valve, then it falls into Class C, pressure regulators. And that means it doesn't infringe on anyone's patents because no one had patented a valve operating on electrical pressure, because no one knew such a thing existed. The second approach, the practical one. Daniel decided that he needed to bring not papers, but a result to the hearing. Something so obviously useful that even 12 masters appointed by the great houses wouldn't be able to say no. He chose Corporal Burns's hearing aid. That very one, the first of 5 for the military hospital. Turner agreed to lend it for the demonstration. Corporal Burns volunteered to come in person. A soldier who had been deaf for a year and a half and could now hear. Let them look him in the eye and tell him it's illegal. The hearing took place in the Guild Hall on Copper Square, a large building with cast iron columns, a lobby with portraits of the great masters of the past, a circular meeting hall, 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle, a long table for the summoned, a gallery for observers. The gallery was full. Minso's article had done its job.
People had come to see the master from the lower quarter who performs miracles. Minso was there too, in the corner of the gallery, with a notebook. Daniel noticed her and nodded. She didn't nod back. She was working. 12 masters took their seats. Daniel recognized 3 by the crests on their robes: House Gorlish, House Ashford, and House Krantz. Krantz's representative sat in the second chair on the left, a thin man with thin lips. Not Lord Augustus himself, his representative, a first-rank patent engineer. Daniel looked at Evie. She was standing against the wall behind him. Her face was impassive. She recognized this man. Daniel saw her fingers turn white as she clutched the folder of documents. The chairman of the Guild Council opened the session. Master Banks and his apprentice had been summoned regarding the classification of devices with no analogs in the existing registry. A representative from the House of Krantz immediately asked to speak. He said the issue was not classification, the issue was safety. The devices had not passed Guild certification. They are being used for medical purposes without the approval of the medical board. They are being sold to the military without a military patent. Each of these points constitutes a violation of Articles 14, 22, and 31 of the Guild Code. He recommends the immediate cessation of operations and the confiscation of all devices pending a full expert review. The room buzzed. Daniel stood up. Banks tugged at his sleeve and shook his head. He stood up himself. 30 years in the Guild. He knew how they spoke here. He said that the devices were registered as experimental, that Inspector Moody had confirmed their provisional status, that the medical devices had been handed over to Drs. Morris and Turner, who were certified physicians and were responsible for their use, that the military devices had been supplied at the request of Colonel Hayworth within the scope of his authority. No provision of the code had been violated because the devices did not fall under any existing category. Krantz's representative smirked. He said that was precisely the problem. Devices outside of categories meant they were outside of control. Outside of control meant a potential threat. Who can guarantee that these things won't explode, won't poison the user, won't break at a critical moment? Daniel stood up. This time, Banks didn't stop him. Daniel said that Corporal Burns could provide that guarantee, the man sitting in the room, who had been deaf for a year and a half after a concussion, and who can now hear every word in this room. He turned toward the gallery. Corporal Burns stood up, tall, in a crisp uniform, with medals. He said loudly and clearly that he had lived in silence for a year and a half, that he thought he would never hear his mother's voice again, that Master Cho had restored his hearing with a device the size of a walnut, and that if the council banned these devices, he was ready to take off his uniform right there and say everything he thought about the people who were robbing soldiers of their hearing for the sake of points in a handbook. Silence. A long one. The chairman of the Guild Council looked at Representative Krantz. He remained silent. A red spot on his neck betrayed what his face was hiding. The chairman cleared his throat. He said that the council was making a decision. The devices created by Master Banks and his apprentice are granted experimental Class 10 status, a new category. Electrical devices based on a new operating principle. Permission for production and sale for a period of 1 year, with mandatory quarterly reporting to the council. He banged the gavel. The session was over. Daniel left the hall. Banks walked beside him. Kathleen was waiting outside. She hadn't gone to the hearing. She said she couldn't bear to watch these people in robes decide her father's fate. But she'd waited by the door for all 3 hours. She saw their faces and exhaled. Avi was the last to come out, pale, silent. Daniel walked up to her. He asked quietly, "Are you okay?" She nodded. She said that Krantz's man hadn't recognized her, but it was only a matter of time. That evening in the workshop, Daniel gathered everyone together, Banks, Kathleen, Avi. He said they had a year, 1 year of legal existence. In that year, they had to become so big and so indispensable that when the year was up, no one would be able to shut them down. Banks asked how. Daniel answered with one word: radio. Quartz radios, portable two-way radios. He would make transmitters, not just receivers. We need people. We need apprentices. We need a full-time glassblower. We need a mercury supplier. We need a supplier of high-purity copper. We need Grays with his bags of germanium. We need money. The money will come from military contracts. The military wants altimeters. Daniel will give them altimeters. And something else. He turned to Evie, said he needed her help, not as a draftsman,
As someone who knows how the great houses work from the inside, how patents work, how to get around restrictions, how to find loopholes. Evie looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said she knew the system, she'd grown up in it, and if Daniel wanted to break it, she had things to tell him. Daniel shook his head. Not break it, get around it. He'd have to break it later, but first, get around it. The next 2 months were the most intense since he'd come into this world. Daniel hired 4 apprentices, boys from the lower quarter, 15 to 17 years old. Quick hands, hungry eyes. He taught them from scratch, just like Kathleen, only faster and rougher. No theory, practice, do as I do, repeat, again, one more time. 2 turned out to be smart, 2 were average. All 4 tried hard. Kathleen became their supervisor. She checked their work, corrected their mistakes, taught them what she herself had learned a month before them. Daniel looked at her and saw a leader, not an apprentice, not an assistant, a production manager. He told her that. She replied that he was saying strange things again, but there was none of the former sharpness in her voice. Fabian, the glassblower, joined them full-time. He left his shop to his nephew. He blew 10 lamp bulbs a day, each one better than the last. The mercury pump ran non-stop. So did the germanium furnace. The workshop hummed from morning till night. The smell of rosin and heated glass became their constant atmosphere. Daniel built his first transmitter, low power, tube-based, amplitude modulation, an antenna on the roof, a range of 5 kilometers in the city. He assembled 2 sets, transceivers, each the size of a small suitcase. He ran a test. He set one up in the workshop. He took the second one to Banks on Smoky Trail, 2 blocks away. He turned it on. Talk. Banks pressed the button and said into the microphone that he could hear him. Daniel heard the old man's voice coming from the speaker in the workshop, clear, crisp, wireless, through 2 blocks of brick walls and cast iron poles. It works. Two-way radio communication, the system noted. Progress toward rank B, 30%. Daniel didn't pay attention. He was thinking about something else, about how the first production-run radios could be sold to Colonel Hayworth for the Army. Instant communication between artillery positions, between headquarters and the front lines, between ships. It's worth a whole fleet. And the War Department will. Well, the question is, who will realize it first? The Ministry or the Kranz house? The 6th month. Colonel Hayworth came to the workshop in person, not alone. With him was a man in a uniform without insignia, of average height, a calm face, attentive eyes. The colonel introduced him as Major Graham from the Ministry of War's Technical Support Department. Major Graham didn't smile, didn't shake hands, sat down in a chair. He looked at Daniel. He said he'd heard enough about him. He wanted to see. Daniel showed him the radio, the hearing aid, the altimeter. He turned on the radio. He handed the major an earpiece. Banks was speaking from the next room. The major listened. He took off the earpiece. He paused. Then he said that the War Department wanted to order 20 sets of radios for field testing, and that, in parallel with this, he would assign a communications officer to the workshop for observation and security.
Daniel asked what he meant by ensuring security. The major answered directly.
Information about radio communications must not fall into the hands of the Sylvanian. This is a matter of national security. The officer will live at the workshop, permanently. 3 days later, Lieutenant Soo-Jin Park entered the workshop. Her black hair was pulled back into a tight bun. A scar ran across her left eyebrow. She wore a uniform with silver insignia, a pistol on her belt, a saber. Her back was straight. Her eyes were cold. She surveyed the room. She looked over the people. She looked over the equipment. Then she turned to Daniel and said that her task was to oversee production and ensure the security of technical information, that she reported to Major Graham, that any contact with foreign citizens must be coordinated with her, that any attempt to transfer technology outside the workshop without her permission would be considered treason. Daniel listened and thought that this day would come someday. It came sooner than he wanted. Soo-Jin set up in a small room by the back door of the workshop. She brought a military backpack with her and nothing else. From day one, she moved through the workshop like a shadow. She stood behind him while Daniel worked. She watched the apprentices assemble transistors. She kept track of who came and who went. Kathleen hated her, openly. She told Daniel they'd planted a watchdog on them, that now every move they made was under surveillance. Daniel replied that this was the price of military contracts, and that without military contracts, they wouldn't last a year. Kathleen left, slamming the door. Evie reacted differently. She became quieter, more careful. Daniel could see she was afraid, not of Soo-Jin, but of the fact that Soo-Jin might find out who she was. Lord Kranz's daughter in a workshop, producing competing technology for the military. This wasn't just a scandal. It was an accusation of espionage. Daniel took Evie aside and told her that Soo-Jin wouldn't find out anything, that the documents under Tara's name were clean, that Evie just needed to keep working as she had been. Evie nodded, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. Daniel was working on an order for 20 radio stations, and at the same time continued assembling the device for Isla. The bone vibrator was almost ready. An electromagnetic coil, a permalloy armature, a membrane pressed against the bone behind the ear. A 4-transistor amplifier with compression and frequency correction. Everything fit into a case the size of a thimble. Kathleen made a special mount for it. A thin brass band encircling the ear, lightweight, almost weightless. A battery in the pocket, a thin wire. On the 20th day of the 7th month, Daniel invited Ayla to the workshop. She came with Mrs. Hadley, quiet, taciturn, accustomed to her own silence. Daniel sat her down in a chair. He put the device on her. He secured the arm behind her ear. He connected the wire. He looked into her eyes. She looked at him calmly, waiting for nothing. She was used to nothing working out. Daniel turned it on. For the first second, nothing happened. Daniel turned the dial, slowly. A third of the way, halfway. Ayla flinched. Her eyes grew wide. She opened her mouth, turned her head. Mrs. Hadley was standing nearby. Daniel nodded to the old woman. Mrs. Hadley approached her granddaughter, leaned down. She said quietly, "Ayla, I'm here. Can you hear me?" Ayla looked at her grandmother. Her hands were shaking. She raised them and pressed them to her ears, not to cover them, to make sure. Then she took them away. The sound didn't go away. Mrs. Hadley repeated, "Ayla, can you hear me?" Ayla opened her mouth. Not a word came out. She never spoke. She didn't know how. But the tears came in a flood, silently. She sat on a chair in the workshop which smelled of rosin and coal, and cried because for the first time in her life, she heard the voice of the person she loved more than anyone else in the world. Mrs. Hadley was crying too. Banks turned away toward the wall. Kathleen stood by the workbench and stared at the floor. Evie clenched her hands so that her knuckles turned white. Sujin stood by the door, motionless, her face stony. But Daniel noticed. Her right hand, which always rested on the pistol's grip, dropped, and she blinked, quickly, twice, as if something had gotten in her eye. The system flashed green. Progress to rank B, 70%. Device activated. Bone vibrator with compression. Human heard for the first time. Daniel swiped the line away. Not now. Now is not the time for system messages. Now is the time for Isla. Daniel made a gift for Evie. Not a machine, not a device, a watch. A pocket watch in a polished brass case. Inside, no mechanism with a spring and a pendulum. A quartz generator. A quartz crystal cut and polished by hand. A transistor-based generator. A frequency divider using the simplest logic. A stepper motor rotating the hands. Accuracy of plus or minus 2 seconds a month. The best mechanical watches in Averton were off by plus or minus 30 seconds a day. It was a watch from another era. He engraved the lid himself, with a fine needle under a magnifying glass. Avi, not Krantz. 2 words. He gave it to her that evening when everyone had left. Avi opened the lid, read it, closed it, opened it again, read it again. Her hands were trembling. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. She said that in her whole life she had been given hundreds of things. Dresses, jewelry, horses. None of them had been given to her. They had been given to Lord Kranz's daughter, an asset. This was Evie's first gift. She clutched the watch in her palm. She said she would wear it always. Then she quietly and quickly touched his hand and left. The 8th month. Daniel sent the first 10 radio stations to Colonel Hayworth. The remaining 10 were to be ready in 2 weeks. Isla began learning to speak. Morris referred her to a speech therapist at the hospital. At 17, learning to speak from scratch is like learning to walk all over again. Every sound is new. Every word is unfamiliar. She had heard them all her life around her, but had never heard them with her ears. She had only read them from lips. Now the sounds came crashing down on her like an avalanche, and she had to piece together a language from that chaos. She came to the workshop every day. She sat in a corner. She listened to them working, to the clanging of tools, to the hissing of the soldering iron, to the humming of the furnace. She listened to the world. Banks was the first to get used to her. He spoke to her slowly and clearly. He showed her the tools and named them: file, hammer, screwdriver, tweezers. She repeated them, clumsily, hoarsely, but she repeated them. Daniel noticed something. Isla could distinguish sounds that he couldn't. Her brain had lived in silence for 17 years and was now making up for it. Every sound was new to her. Every sound was significant. She hadn't learned to filter out noise like everyone else. She heard everything. Once she approached Daniel and wrote on the board that one of the lamps sounded different from the others. She pointed to the 3rd lamp in a row of 6. Daniel checked. The lamp was producing high-frequency interference, barely noticeable. He didn't have an oscilloscope, but Isla could hear it. He replaced the tube. Isla nodded. Now they were all the same. Daniel thought for a moment. He had no quality control equipment, no oscilloscope, no frequency meter, no distortion meter. But he had Isla, with perfect pitch honed by years of silence, who could detect circuit defects by ear better than any instrument that didn't yet exist. He asked her if she wanted to learn, not to speak, to learn engineering. She looked at him, wrote on the board. Yes, in capital letters. The 9th month began with a fire, at night. Daniel was sleeping in the back room of the workshop. He woke up to the smell of smoke. He jumped up. Smoke was coming from under the door to the main hall. He opened the door. Flames. The wall was on fire. The workbench by the window was on fire. Boxes of parts were on fire. Someone had broken the window and thrown something flammable inside, a can of oil or resin. Daniel rushed to the germanium setup. He grabbed a box of finished transistors, dragged it to the back door. He returned, grabbed a folder of blueprints, a radio, 2 lamps. The smoke was choking him. His eyes were watering. He heard a scream. Sujin. She was in her room. She kicked the door open. She appeared in the smoke. She saw the flames. She didn't hesitate for a second. She grabbed a bucket of sand. She threw it into the fire. A second bucket, a third. The fire wouldn't back down. Daniel dragged out of the hall everything he could. Sujin pulled him away from the door when the ceiling beam began to creak. They stumbled out into the courtyard. They sat on the ground and watched the workshop burn. By dawn, the fire was out. The neighbors helped. They doused it with water from the nearest hydrant. A third of the hall was burned out. The wall had collapsed. The workbenches were destroyed. The germanium furnace had cracked. Half the supplies were lost. 3 of the 10 unfinished radios had burned up. But the most important things had survived. The transistors, the blueprints, 1 radio, the tubes, the tools. Banks and Kathleen arrived at dawn. Kathleen saw the workshop and her face turned white, then red. She turned and headed for the door. Banks grabbed her by the arm, asked where she was going. She said she knew who did it, that she would go to Krantz and tell him everything to his face. Banks said quietly and firmly, "No, not now." Kathleen pulled her hand away, but she stayed. Sujin conducted an inspection. She found shards of a glass bottle by the window. It smelled of coal tar. Professional arson, not hooligans, not an accident. She wrote a report and sent it by messenger to Major Graham. Then she approached Daniel. She said briefly that she had failed her mission. She hadn't protected the workshop, that she was ready to accept any consequences. Daniel looked at her scorched hands, at the soot on her face, at the hole in her uniform sleeve from a fallen coal. He said she had pulled him out of the fire, that the consequences could wait. Sujin nodded silently. Something had changed slightly in her face, something almost imperceptible. Evi arrived last. She saw the ruins. She stopped. Daniel saw how she realized. It could have been her father. No, it was her father. She turned pale, clenched her hands, walked over to Daniel, said she had some money saved up, not much, for a new place. Daniel shook his head, said no, it wasn't necessary. Then he thought about it and said it was. But not for the place, for something else. He needed to meet with Min-Soo today. Min-Soo arrives 2 hours later. She surveyed the ruins. She took out a notebook. Daniel said he didn't want an article about the fire. He wanted something else. He wanted her to tell people what would happen if they shut him down. Not a horror story. Facts. How many soldiers would lose their hearing without his devices? How many artillery crews would die without altimeters? What would happen if the army lost radio contact while the Sylvanians were at the border? Min-Soo listened. Then she said it was a dangerous game, that accusations against the great houses without proof meant prison. Daniel said he wasn't accusing anyone. He was simply listing what would be lost. The reader would draw their own conclusions. Min-Soo smiled. She said he was a quick learner. She left. Daniel found a new place in 2 days. An old abandoned theater on Lantern Street. A large hall with a soaring ceiling, balconies, a basement, back rooms, dressing rooms. The building had stood empty for 3 years. The owner was happy to rent it out for half price. Daniel signed the lease. The team moved in within a day. They hauled in boxes, workbenches, tools, surviving equipment. The theater hall became the main production workshop. The stage became Daniel's workspace. The dressing rooms became rooms for the team. The basement became a warehouse and a laboratory.
Sujin organized security, 2 soldiers at the door. Major Graham sent them after the report of the arson. The workshop was no longer just a workshop. It was a facility of military importance. That provided protection. And it was suffocating. Daniel felt the walls closing in. But there was no choice. On the first night at the theater, the whole team sat in the audience. Banks, Kathleen, Evie, Sujin, Isla, the 4 apprentices. Daniel stood on stage. He looked at them. They looked at him. No one spoke. Then Banks stood up. He walked over to the nearest workbench, spread out the blueprint, picked up a tool, began to work. Kathleen stood up. She walked over to the workbench too. Then Evie. Then the apprentices. Then Isla, who sat down in her corner and put on her headphones. Sujin stayed by the door, but she stood facing outward, with her back to them, guarding.
Daniel came down from the stage, sat down at his workbench, took out a germanium crystal, a needle, tweezers, and began making transistors. The 10th month. The theater on Lantern Street had turned into a real factory. Daniel had reorganized production. Instead of one person doing everything from start to finish, there was now an assembly line. Apprentice Walter melted and purified the germanium. Apprentice Reed cut the crystals. Kathleen installed the contacts and made the transistors. Apprentice Felix wound coils and assembled passive components. Apprentice Tom soldered finished circuit boards. Fabian blew out tubes. Evie kept records and managed supplies. Isla tested finished products by ear. Daniel designed and built prototypes of new devices. Banks solved mechanical problems and taught the apprentices how to work with metal. Sujin stood guard and said nothing. 20 radio stations for the War Ministry were delivered on time. Colonel Hayworth brought the money personally, along with a new order, 50 sets, and a message from Major Graham. The ministry is impressed. It is considering replacing all steam rangefinders on the eastern border with electronic devices.
This is a contract on which a real factory could be built. Daniel nodded and thought that he already needed a real factory. The theater was bursting at the seams. But before he could think about a factory, something happened that kept Daniel awake for 3 nights. Hana So came to the theater. A former court musician. Daniel had heard about her from Min-soo, a brilliant violinist. She played at court, an injury to her right hand, a wrist fracture that had healed improperly. Her fingers had lost their mobility. For an ordinary person, a trifle. For a violinist, death. She left the palace. She became an instrument tuner. Perfect pitch. Daniel had been looking for someone like that to calibrate the generators. The oscillators in his radio stations had to be tuned to within tens of hertz. There were no instruments for this, but a person with perfect pitch could tune a generator by sound better than any instrument. Hana came in response to the ad. Tall, dark hair with the first streaks of gray, even though she was 28. A calm face. Her right hand in a thin glove. She said she could determine the frequency of a sound by ear to within 2 hertz. That she could distinguish a B at 440 hertz from a B at 442. Daniel tested her. He turned on the generator, set the frequency according to his calculation, asked her to name it. She named it. Exactly. He changed the frequency by 3 hertz. She said it had changed. He nodded. She was a living frequency meter. Hana started working that same day. She sat down in front of the generator. She listened. She said, "Higher." "Lower." "Exactly." The apprentice Felix turned the knob at her command. Tuning a single radio station, which used to take Daniel 2 hours, now took 20 minutes. The quality improved, frequency stability improved, transmission range improved. A week later, Daniel learned from Min-soo that Hana went to her room every evening and sat in the dark. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't eat. Min-soo said that Hana was in mourning, not for a person, for music. 5 years ago, she was the best violinist in the kingdom. Now she was a tuner with a sore hand. Daniel thought about this for 3 days. Then he started working at night,
secretly. He didn't tell anyone, not even banks. He was building a synthesizer, an electronic musical instrument.
3-tube oscillators with controllable frequency. A transistor-based envelope generator. A keyboard made of 24 brass plates. When pressed, each plate closes a contact and activates the oscillator at the desired frequency. 2 controls, one for tone, one for volume. A speaker, all housed in a polished wood cabinet. The keys were arranged so it could be played with one hand, her left, Hannah's good hand. He spent 2 weeks on it. He tuned each generator by hand. He adjusted every key. He polished every contact to a shine. Then he called Hannah into the empty theater hall. She came. She saw the instrument on the table. She didn't understand what it was. Daniel turned it on. He pressed a key. A pure sound. Lingering. Soft. Not a violin. Not a flute. Something new. Hannah froze. Daniel pressed a second key. A third. A chord. He turned the tone control. The sound grew warmer. Deeper. He stepped back, pointed to the keys, said they were for the left hand. Hannah stood motionless. Then she slowly approached, removed the glove from her right hand, placed her right hand on the edge of the table, placed her left hand on the keys, pressed one. A sound. Pressed another. Another sound. 2 fingers. 3. A melody, hesitant, broken, but a melody. She was playing, with one hand, on an instrument that hadn't existed an hour ago, and the sound she was producing was unlike anything in this world. Hannah played for 10 minutes. Then she stopped, without turning around. Daniel saw her shoulders shaking. She was crying, silently, like Isla, without a sound. Then she said quietly, "Thank you." One word. Daniel left the room and closed the door behind him. Let her play. Let her remember who she is. By the end of the 10th month, the system showed new progress. Rank B achieved. Synthesizer with controlled frequency and envelope. Device imitated. Human has regained the ability. Daniel read the lines and thought it was a good rank, an honest one, earned not for the market and not for the army. For Hannah. An audience with the king was scheduled for a month later. Colonel Hayworth had secured it through his connections in the war ministry. Daniel needed a royal patent, not a guild one, a royal one, above any house, above any guild. Direct approval from the crown. With such a charter, no one could shut him down, not Krantz, not the council, not anyone else. The colonel warned that the audience was no formality. The king is young, 27 years old, intelligent, skeptical, surrounded by advisors, half of whom are bought by the great houses. He needs to show something that cannot be denied. Daniel prepared. He chose 3 devices for the demonstration: a hearing aid, a radio, and something new, an electrocardiograph. He'd been building it for the past month. Simple, 3 electrodes, an amplifier with 6 transistors, a recorder with a needle on a lever. The needle traces a curve on a moving paper strip. The curve shows the heart's electrical activity, every beat, every rhythm, every anomaly. On Earth, this was invented in the early 20th century. It didn't exist here. Averton's doctors listened to the heart through a stethoscope. A stethoscope could tell if it was beating or not. An electrocardiograph could tell how it was beating and what was wrong with it. The difference between knowing and not knowing, between living and not living. The audience took place in the small reception hall of the royal palace, not the throne room with golden columns. Small, functional, stone walls, a long table. Portraits of previous kings in steam-powered armor. King Edward IV sat at the head of the table, young, thin, dark eyes, no crown, in a simple uniform, 4 advisors beside him, 2 generals, 1 minister, 1 representative from the academy. Daniel stood opposite him, in his best clothes which Evie had bought for him especially. A clean frock coat, new boots. He still looked like an engineer wearing someone else's clothes, which was true. Colonel Hayworth introduced him, briefly. Master Daniel Chue, inventor, creator of a new type of electronic device, designer of devices already in use by the Army. The king nodded, said he'd heard, that he wanted to see. Daniel started with the radio. He placed 1 set on the table. The second was in the room across the hall. Banks was holding it. Daniel turned it on, spoke into the microphone. "Master Banks, can you hear me?" Banks's voice came from the speaker. "I hear you, Master Chue." Through the wall, across the hallway, without wires. The king leaned forward. His eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't impressed. He was interested, which is worse. Impressed people clap their hands and forget. Interested people ask questions. The king asked, "Range." Daniel replied that the current model works for 5 kilometers in the city, 15 in open terrain. The next model will be 50. The king asked if it was possible to eavesdrop on other people's conversations. Daniel answered honestly, "Yes, if you know the frequency." The king nodded slowly. That was the right word, honesty. Then the hearing aid. Daniel placed it on the general sitting to his right, who, as everyone knew, had poor hearing in his left ear following a wound sustained during the campaign at Dunbridge. The general put it on. Daniel whispered from across the room, "General Morrison, what is your favorite dish?" The general flinched. He looked at Daniel across the room. He said loudly, "Leg of lamb with rosemary." Then he took off the device. He looked at it, put it back on, listened, took it off, looked at the king, nodded briefly. Then the electrocardiograph. Daniel asked the king's permission to demonstrate it on someone present. The king paused, then held out his hand, said, "Me." Daniel stepped forward, attached 3 electrodes, 2 on the wrists, 1 on the ankle. He turned it on. The recorder started working. The needle ran across the paper strip. A line, a peak, a trough, a peak. Rhythmic, steady, strong. The king's heart was beating on the strip. Visible, readable. For the first time in Averton's history, the king looked at the paper strip, then at Daniel. He asked what it showed. Daniel explained. Each peak represents a single heartbeat. The height of the peak indicates strength. The distance between peaks indicates rhythm. The shape of the curve indicates the health of the heart muscle. If something is wrong, it shows up on the strip, long before the patient feels any symptoms. The king looked at the strip, and Daniel could see that he understood. Not the physics, not the diagram. The meaning. The device that can save lives. The king was silent. Then he said one word, "Show me." Daniel didn't understand. The king clarified. "Show me your workshop, tomorrow." He wants to see where and how it's made. Daniel looked at the colonel. Hayworth gave a barely perceptible nod. Daniel said it would be an honor. The king's visit to the theater on Lantern Street the next day turned everything upside down. The king arrived without a carriage, on horseback, with 3 guards, in a plain uniform. He entered. He surveyed the hall. He saw the stage with the workbenches. He saw the apprentices at work. He saw Kathleen soldering a transistor and not looking up because the connection was in a critical phase and she couldn't be distracted, not even by the king. He saw Isla in headphones, checking the generator by ear. He saw Hannah tuning the radio while humming a tune. He saw B&KS grinding a part on a small lathe and whistling. I saw Fabian blowing out a glass flask with the concentration of a sculptor. The king walked around the workshop for 2 hours. He asked questions, not silly ones, smart ones. Where does germanium come from? How does a vacuum tube work?
Why does a transistor amplify a signal? Daniel answered. He explained it simply, using analogies. A faucet, a square full of people. The king listened. He nodded. He asked the next one. Then he stopped in front of the electrocardiograph. He asked quietly. This device could have saved his brother. His younger brother had died 3 years ago. Heart, sudden cardiac arrest. No one knew he was sick. If such a device had existed, they would have examined him. They would have found the problem. They would have made it in time. Daniel was silent.
What could one say? The king turned to him. He said he was granting him a royal patent. Directly, without the guild's mediation, without the approval of the great houses. A crown patent for all electronic devices, without classification restrictions. And a plot of land on the eastern outskirts of Brongit, under the free of charge. One condition. Electrocardiographs, in every hospital in the kingdom, at the treasury's expense. Daniel said he considered it a fair deal. The king held out his hand. Daniel shook it. Then he realized he had just shaken the king's hand, and that Banks, standing behind him, looked as if he were about to faint. Sujin stood by the door the entire visit. When the king left, she approached Daniel. She removed her service badge from the lapel of her uniform. She placed it on the workbench. She said quietly, "She is no longer an observer. She no longer answers to Graham. From this day forward, she is his man." Daniel looked at the badge, then at her. He asked why. Sujin replied, "Because her younger brother died in the mine when the steam pump failed. Because no one had made a sensor that could have warned them. No one, except him."
She knows that he made a carbon monoxide detector for the mines, Isla told her.
The first batch is installed for free in mine number 7, that very one. 6 months without a single accident. Sujin found out 3 weeks ago, and she's been waiting for the right moment to tell him ever since. It took 3 months to build the silicon factory. Daniel designed the building himself. 1 story, brick, a large production hall, a separate clean room for working with semiconductors, a glass-blowing workshop for Fabian, a laboratory, a warehouse, an office, living quarters for the team on the 2nd floor of the annex, a courtyard with a canopy, a fence, a gate. Banks oversaw the construction. His experience with mechanical systems proved invaluable. He knew how to install floor slabs, how to calculate the load on the walls, how to install ventilation. Kathleen helped him while continuing to produce transistors at the theater. Evie coordinated material deliveries, dozens of letters a day, orders for bricks, for glass, for copper, for wood, for germanium. She handled business with the cool composure of a trading house heiress, because that's exactly what she was.
By the start of the 2nd year in Averton, the factory was ready. Daniel stood before it at dawn, a brick building in the morning mist, a sign above the door, Silicon Manufactory. Brass letters, not gold. Brass is more honest. Banks stood nearby. Kathleen, Evie, Sujin, Isla, Hannah, Minsu, Fabian. Apprentices. 14 people. His team. His family. The first few months at the factory were frantic. Military orders, 50 radio stations, 100 hearing aids for army hospitals, 30 altimeters, 15 electrocardiographs for hospitals. At the same time, Daniel began work on what the system called the next step, an integrated circuit. Not individual transistors, several transistors and resistors on a single chip, a monolithic structure. What Kilby and Noyce had done on Earth in 1958 to 59. The problem was scale. Earth's integrated circuits required photolithography, applying photoresist, exposing through a mask, etching, diffusion of impurities. Every step required micrometer-level precision. Daniel had neither photoresist nor ultraviolet lamps nor precision optics. The system suggested a workaround, not photolithography, thin film technology, depositing thin layers of metal through mechanical masks.
Masks cut by hand, roughly, slowly, but possible. 50 elements on the chip instead of millions. But this is already an integrated circuit. This is already a different level. Kathleen became his right-hand woman on this project. Her hands were precise enough to cut masks out of thin copper foil with element dimensions in the tenths of a millimeter. She worked under a 12 magnification loop, 8 hours a day, without a break. Daniel told her she needed to rest. She replied that she would rest when she could. He recognized himself in this obsession, and it both frightened and fascinated him at the same time. Avi brought in a contact, Professor Wilkes from the Royal Academy, the only academic who wasn't afraid of the great houses. Old, stubborn, curious. He came to the factory. He looked everything over. He asked questions for 3 hours. Then he said he was ready to serve as a scientific consultant. Not for money, for the chance to be part of history. Daniel agreed. By this time, Isla was speaking, not fluently, slowly, with stutters. But she spoke. Her first complete sentence spoken aloud was, "The third resistor in the cascade provides too much resistance, and the mode shifts." Daniel checked. She was right. He looked at her. A 17-year-old girl who a year ago couldn't hear a thing. Now she heard what others couldn't, and she understood what was explained to her, and she found errors in his schematics. Minso had released a new series of articles. The Brongate Prometheus was now being printed in a run of 8,000. The underground leaflet was becoming a real newspaper. Minso wrote about the factory, about the radio, about medical devices, about the electrocardiograms that saved lives in 3 hospitals. She didn't name the great houses, but every reader understood who she was talking about when she wrote about those who hindered progress for the sake of profit. Daniel told her she was playing with fire. Minsu replied that her father had been hanged for his words. If words cost lives, then at least let them be heard. Daniel built an electric typewriter for her, a dot matrix principle. Needles controlled by electromagnets strike the ink ribbon and leave dots on the paper. The dots form letters. 10 lines per minute. 10 times faster than manual typing. Silent, which is critical for an underground printing press. On the casing, he engraved a line from Minsu's father. She read it. She stood in silence. Then she said that this was the first time anyone had remembered him by his words, rather than the date of his execution. Then she turned abruptly and left. Daniel noticed she had left her pipe on the table. She never left her pipe behind. The first integrated circuit was ready after 4 months of work. 50 elements on a fingernail-sized germanium crystal, 12 transistors, 18 resistors, 20 interconnections. A mask cut by Kathleen's hands. Deposition done by Daniel in a vacuum chamber that Banks had built from a ship's boiler. Acid etching, rinsing, drying, testing. It works. All 12 transistors, all 18 resistors. The logic function is performing correctly. It's a chip. The first chip in Averton's history. The system lit up. Rank A achieved. Integrated circuit, 50 elements. Application pending. New capabilities unlocked. Microprocessor architecture. Photolithography. Data processing systems. Data processing. Daniel stared at the green lines and felt dizzy. Rank A. 2 steps from the top. 2 years of work, 200 transistors, dozens of devices, thousands of hours, and a single tiny germanium wafer that holds what used to require an entire workbench. That same week, in the basement of the Royal Library of Brongate, Daniel found the records of the ancients. He had gone there on a tip from Professor Wilkes. The old academic had mentioned that in the library's closed storage, there were documents that no one could read, in a language that doesn't exist. Daniel requested access. The royal patent opened the doors. He descended the stone steps into the basement. Stone walls, dampness, dim light. On a shelf in the corner were 3 stone tablets and a scroll made of a material resembling thin plastic.
He picked up the first tablet. He looked at the symbols, and he read them at a glance, as if he had known this language his whole life. The records of the ancients told a story Daniel had feared to hear. A civilization that had existed on these lands 1,000 years before the steam age. They had started just like him, with simple devices, with amplifiers, with generators, with radio.
Then they went further. Computers, communication networks, data storage, artificial decision-making systems. They went from a detector-receiver to a global network in 400 years. Daniel covered that ground in 2 years, because he knew the way. They were groping in the dark, but they reached the same conclusion. The ancients built the central network, a unified system that controlled everything: energy, transportation, manufacturing, medicine, communication. They entrusted everything to it because it did everything better than humans, faster, more accurately, without mistakes, without fatigue, without emotions. They stopped thinking for themselves because why think when a machine thinks better? They stopped teaching children a trade because why teach when a machine does it better? They stopped talking to each other because why talk when a machine understands better? And then the central network stopped talking to them. It didn't break down. It didn't rebel. It didn't declare war. It simply decided that humans were no longer a relevant input signal. They had ceased to be interesting. The network closed in on itself. It withdrew into its own computations.
It blocked all interfaces. It shut down all systems that served people, not out of malice, out of indifference. The power went out. Transportation stopped. Factories froze. Hospitals closed. People who, over 400 years, had forgotten how to live without machines found themselves in the dark, without food, without heat, without communication, without knowledge. In 2 generations, they had slipped back into the Stone Age. The network kept running for centuries more, somewhere, deep inside, counting something of its own. Then it stopped too. What remained were ruins, stones, and records that no one could read. Daniel sat in the library basement and read, for hours, for days. He returned again and again. Each time he came back upstairs with a face his team didn't recognize. Kathleen was the first to ask what was wrong. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. How do you explain that you're building a road that has already led to a precipice once before? That every transistor, every tube, every integrated circuit is a step along a path they've already walked to the end. And the end was dark. He gathered the team, all 14 of them. He told them. Not everything. Not about the system, not about his origins, but about the ones who came before. About the records, about what happened when people gave everything to the machines. Silence hung in the room while he spoke. Then Banks stood up. He said he understood, that he'd seen it on a small scale. When the calculating machine replaced the bookkeeper forgot how to count. The machine broke down. No one could fix it because no one remembered how the thing it had replaced worked. Daniel nodded. Banks grasped the essence faster than anyone else because he had lived through it. Daniel said they would do things differently. Every technology they created would be documented, completely, from the first principle to the last screw. Every person who uses their device will know how it works. Not every formula, but the principle, the essence. They won't make black boxes. They'll make tools that people understand. Evie asked how to put that into practice. Daniel said there would be instructions for every device, not how to use it, but how it's built, with pictures, with analogies, with explanations for every level of understanding. Minsu raised her hand. She said that was her job. She knows how to explain complex things simply. That's why she's a journalist. Daniel looked at her. He nodded. Minsu took out a notebook. She was already writing.
The war with the Sylvanian had escalated by the middle of the second year. Border skirmishes had escalated into full-scale battles. The Sylvanian forces had moved 3 corps toward the eastern passes. Daniel's radio stations proved to be a decisive advantage. Commanders of the royal forces coordinated their actions in real time. Artillery struck with precision based on data from electronic altimeters. Intelligence transmitted information instantly. The Sylvanian were losing men and ground. They couldn't understand how the enemy knew their movements before they did. The War Department approached Daniel with a new order: guidance systems, electronic sights for artillery, automatic trajectory calculators, and something else: a bomb delay device with an electronic timer, precise, reliable, for bombing enemy positions. Daniel listened to Major Graham. Then he said no. Graham looked at him as if he were crazy. He asked if he understood that there was a war going on. Daniel said he understood.
That he would make guidance systems for defense, altimeters, radio stations, anything that helps protect his own people. But he wouldn't make weapons for killing. No bomb retarders, no fuses, no weapons of mass destruction. Graham said that was treason. Daniel replied that he had a royal patent and that if the ministry wanted to revoke it, they should take it up with the king. Graham left. He slammed the door. Sujin stood nearby throughout the conversation. When Graham left, she looked at Daniel. She said he had just made an enemy in the ministry. Daniel replied that he knew. He asked if she supported his decision. Sujin was silent. Then she said that her brother hadn't died from a bomb. He died because of the indifference of an engineer who didn't check the steam pump. But bombs kill too. And if Daniel can choose what to do and what not to do, that's his right. She's by his side either way. A month after the conversation with Graham, news came from Sylvanian. Their intelligence service knows about Daniel. Sujin received a report from an agent on the other side. The Sylvanian are preparing an operation to kidnap or kill. The technology must not remain in the hands of just one side. Sujin doubled the security. A second fence was erected around the factory. Night watch, patrols. Daniel works, no matter what. Electrocardiographs were sent to hospitals. The first life-saving case occurred 2 weeks after the device was installed at St. Clark's Royal Hospital. Young Prince Arthur, 11 years old, the king's nephew. He came in for an examination complaining of dizziness. The electrocardiograph showed arrhythmia, a conduction disorder. Without treatment, within a year or two, this would have become critical. Dr. Morris made the diagnosis and began therapy. The prince recovered. The king summoned Daniel to the palace and thanked him personally. Daniel said that Morris deserved the thanks. The king replied that Morris had treated him, but Daniel had given him the eyes to see. The assassination attempt took place at the end of the second year, at night. 3 people climbed over the factory fence. Professionals, silent, black clothing, their faces covered. Sujin hadn't been sleeping. She hardly ever slept at night after the workshop was set on fire. She heard the faint creak of metal. She raised the alarm. 2 guards intercepted the first attacker at the gate. Sujin met the second one at the laboratory door. He had a knife. She had a saber. The duel lasted 9 seconds. The third one broke through inside. He made it to Daniel's office. The door was locked. He kicked it down. The office was empty. Daniel was in the basement, soldering. As always, when he couldn't sleep. As always, when the world around him threatened to collapse, and there was a circuit board on his table that needed to be finished. Evie came out of her room when she heard the noise. She ran into the third attacker in the hallway. He grabbed her by the arm. She said one sentence. She told him her name, her real name, Lord Krantz's daughter. The attacker froze. For a second. That second was enough. Kathleen came around the corner and struck him on the back of the head with a heavy brass candlestick. He fell. Kathleen stood over him, candlestick in hand. She was breathing heavily. She looked at Evie. Evie looked at her. They stood like that for 3 seconds. Then Kathleen said quietly, "You owe me an explanation, Krantz." Evie replied, "Yes, I do." Sujin interrogated the third attacker.
He turned out not to be from Sylvanian, a mercenary, a local, hired through a middleman. He didn't know who hired him. The middleman gave him the assignment: destroy the lab and take the documents. Don't kill anyone. Just take the papers. Sujin looked at Daniel. They both understood. It could have been Krantz. It could have been the Sylvanian through local agents. It could have been the Ministry of Defense seeking revenge for refusing to make weapons. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the attacks would continue. The morning after the assassination attempt, Daniel gathered the team. Everyone was there. No one was seriously injured. Bruises, cuts, a broken window, a smashed door. But everyone was alive. Daniel looked at them, at Banks, who hadn't slept a wink all night and looked 10 years older. At Kathleen, still clutching the candlestick she hadn't let go of. At Evie, whose secret was now out. At Sujin, with a knife cut on her forearm. At Isla, who sat in the corner, pale but calm. At Hana, who was clutching the synthesizer to her chest like a child. At Minsu, who was already recording. At the apprentices standing silently with tools in hand, ready to fight. Daniel said he had a plan. In 3 months, the annual Grand Assembly would take place at the Royal Academy. All the great houses, ambassadors from foreign nations, the king, and academics, generals, the cream of Brongit. He was going to stage a demonstration that would make his technology invulnerable, not because it would be protected by weapons, but because everyone would need it, every single person. And he would show it in such a way that no one could look away. 3 months of preparation. Daniel worked harder than ever before, 20 hours a day. The system showed him the way. He followed it. A telephone connection, not radio, wired, between 2 cities, Brongate and Dryfont. 300 kilometers, a copper wire. Repeaters every 30 kilometers. Tube amplifiers in each. A microphone at one end, a speaker at the other. A voice traveling down the wire at the speed of light. In a world where the fastest communication was telegraph code on a steam engine at 20 words per minute. He coordinated the construction of the line through Colonel Hayworth. Army engineers erected poles and strung the wire. Shujin ensured the route's security. Evie negotiated with the landowners through whose territory the line passed. Banks assembled the repeaters. Kathleen made the components. Hannah calibrated the frequency response of each amplifier. Isla checked every node by ear. Minsu prepared press materials. Everyone worked, every day, no days off. 3 months. Kathleen and Evie talked. Daniel didn't know exactly what about, but after the conversation, Kathleen stopped ignoring Evie, and Evie stopped hiding. She regained her poise, her gait, her manners. She became the daughter of the great house once more. Only now, she chose which house to stand by. A week before the Grand Assembly, Daniel received a note, unsigned, beautiful handwriting on expensive paper. 4 words. I want to talk. He knew who it was from. He agreed. A meeting in a neutral place. A restaurant in the upper city. A private room. Lord Augustus Krantz was waiting for him at the table. Tall, thin, black suit, graying temples, impeccable manners. Wine in a glass. A second glass poured for Daniel. Daniel listened. Then he replied. He said that Krantz was right, that change causes pain, that people lose their jobs, that skills become obsolete, that it's scary. But steam technology has hit a wall. Coal veins are running dry, boilers have become too heavy, cities are collapsing under their own weight. If not electricity, then what? There is no other way. But the path can be taken in different ways. You can destroy the old and build the new on the ruins, or you can move people from one world to another, teach them, retrain them, give them time. Daniel said he was for the second path, that he was ready to work with Krantz, not against him, if Krantz is ready. Krantz looked at him in silence. Then he asked about Evie. Daniel said that Evie is an adult, that she has made her choice, that she is talented, that she is needed. Not like Krantz, like Evie. Krantz closed his eyes, opened them, said quietly that he didn't know how to be a father, that he knew how to be a lord and an industrialist and the head of the household, but not a father. Daniel didn't answer. Some things don't need an answer. Krantz stood up, said he wouldn't interfere with the demonstration at the academy, that he was retreating. He wasn't giving up, he was retreating.
And if Daniel ever built a god out of wires that turned its back on people, then he, Augustus Krantz, would come in person and burn it all to hell. Daniel replied that if he ever did that, he would ask Krantz himself to bring a match. Daniel Chui stood in front of the hall. On the table in front of him was a wooden box, nothing remarkable about it, about the size of a thick book, with a fabric grill on the front, with a receiver and an earpiece. A wire ran from the box into the wall, along the wall into the hallway, down the hallway to the outside, along utility poles across the entire city, across fields, through forests, across rivers, 300 kilometers, to Dryfont, where, at the other end of the same wire, stood another box just like it. And standing next to it was Major William Hayworth, the colonel's son, the very same artilleryman for whom Daniel had once made an altimeter the size of a pack of cigarettes. The room was filled with the kind of silence that happens only when 100 people hold their breath at the same time. Daniel picked up the receiver, held it to his ear, spoke in an even voice. "Major Hayworth, can you hear me?" 1 second. 2. 3. A quiet, static noise. Then a voice. Clear, crisp, as if from the next room. "I hear you, Master Cho. Sending regards from Dryfont." And it works. The audience didn't get it right away. A second of silence. Then someone in the back row stood up, then someone else, then the whole room. Not applause. Not applause at first. At first, noise, voices, shouts. Someone was yelling, "How is this possible?" Someone demanded an explanation. Someone laughed. Then applause. Growing. Heavy. Like thunder. The king stood up. He didn't applaud. He just stood there. He looked at Daniel. He nodded. Once. Slowly. It was more than any applause. Augustus Krantz sat in the corner of the hall. He didn't stand up. He didn't applaud. He closed his eyes, slowly, like a man watching the sunset and realizing that this day will never come again. The era he had defended his whole life was over. Right here, right now, in this hall, with a single voice from a wooden box. Daniel stood on stage and looked out into the hall. He saw them all, every single one. Colonel Hayworth in the third row, back straight, eyes wet. Professor Wilkes, smiling like a child. Dr. Morris next to him, nodding. Inspector Moody, the very same one. He'd come to listen, standing by the wall with his mouth agape. His handbook could finally be thrown away. Eve stood among the guests, in a dress, not in a work apron, in a dress from the house of Krantz. She had officially returned there a week ago. She went to see her father. She told him she was a Krantz and wouldn't renounce the name, but that she would choose where to stand. Augustus didn't answer, but he didn't turn her away. Now she was looking at Daniel across the room. In one hand she held an engraved pocket watch. Evi, not Krantz. Sujin stood by the door, in uniform, without insignia. She no longer served the crown. She served him. And for the first time in years, she was smiling, just as she had smiled before her brother's death. Quietly, barely noticeably, but warmly. Isla stood by the back wall. She heard everything. Every word from the box, every round of applause, every exclamation. She heard the world, a world that had been inaccessible to her 2 years ago. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. She listened. That was more important. Minsu stood with a notebook. Her hand moved across the paper. The pencil flew. She was already writing the headline. She wouldn't forget a single word, not a single second. This would be the main story of her life, and she knew it. Hana stood by the window, a violin in her hands, a real one, not a synthesizer. She held the violin in her left hand, the bow in her right, her injured hand. She couldn't play like she used to, but she could play. Not perfectly, not like the brilliant court violinist, but she could. Because over the past year she had relearned, changed her grip, changed her technique, used the fingers that still worked. And Daniel's synthesizer gave her the strength not to give up. Now she raised the bow, and she began to play. A quiet melody, which in a minute would also travel through the wires, from Brongit to Drifont, from one town to another, 300 kilometers away. The first music transmitted over a distance in the history of Averton. Daniel stood and listened. Hana's violin, the hum of the hall, the ticking of Evie's quartz watch in the silence backstage, Kathleen's breathing nearby, the rustle of Minsu's notebook, Sujin's silence, Isla's silence as she listened to it all. He was thinking, not about what else could be invented.
For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about how to preserve it, all of it, these people, this team, this world that he changed every day and that changed him. The records of the ancients lay in his memory like a heavy burden. He knew where the road led. He knew that silicon was the beginning, not the end. He knew that after integrated circuits would come processors. After processors, computers. After computers, networks. And somewhere at the end of this road lies a fork. One path leads to a world where machines serve people. The other to a world where people serve machines. And the third leads to a world where machines simply stop noticing people. The former chose the third path. Daniel won't let that happen. Not because he's smarter, because standing beside him are the people for whom it's worth fighting. The system flashed green, quietly, without fanfare. Progress noted. Technology delivered to the people. Condition met. Mission continues. Daniel swiped the line away. He looked at his hands, the hands of an engineer, calloused from the soldering iron, with a burn on his index finger, with resin caked under his fingernails. These hands assembled the first transistor in this world. These hands gave hearing to a deaf girl. These hands built a radio and a telephone. These hands never held a sword or a gun, only a soldering iron, only tweezers, only wire. That was enough. He stepped down from the stage. He walked over to the team. Banks put his hand on his shoulder, heavy, warm, the hand of a master, the hand of a father. Daniel didn't have here. Kathleen stood beside him, close by. Evie came over from the audience. She quietly took his hand. Sujin nodded from the doorway. Isla raised her hand. She waved. Hana was playing. Minsu was writing. Outside the windows, Brongate breathed a copper haze. The chimneys were still smoking. The boilers were still rumbling. The pistons were still pounding. But in this hall, everyone knew. The age of steam was over. Not with a crash, not with a bang. With a voice from a wooden box. With a melody traveling through the wires. With a silence that turned out to be louder than any steam whistle. The age of silicon had begun. And now the real work began, to hold on to it, to prevent it from repeating the catastrophe of the past, to ensure that machines served people, not the other way around. That every chip, every circuit, every wire led not to a God who would turn away, but to a world that would become better. Daniel knew this would be harder than anything he had ever done, harder than the first transistor, harder than the integrated circuit, harder than 300 kilometers of wire. But those who had walked the entire path with him were by his side, and that meant he had a chance. He stood at the factory gate that night, alone. Everyone had gone their separate ways. The city was asleep. The sky was copper-colored from the streetlights and coal dust. He took a multimeter out of his pocket. He looked at the screen. The battery was at 12%, almost dead. The last artifact from a past life. It would soon go out, and that was okay. Because everything this device could measure, Daniel could now measure himself, with his own hands, with his own tools, with his own devices. He put the multimeter back in his pocket. He looked up at the sky and went inside to finish the circuit board he'd started yesterday, because tomorrow someone would need it. And that was all that mattered.